Who do you think you are, looking me in the eye? Some black woman in a cheap suit thinking she has rights? That was the line the white officer spat out in the middle of a public parking lot, right in front of 3 witnesses live streaming the moment. He thought she would look down. He thought she would be afraid. But what he didn't know was that this woman was the very reason his entire system would soon be shaking down to its foundation. And when her real identity was revealed, it wasn't just him. The entire state's police department had to bow its head. The internet is on fire. And you, which state are you living in? Do stories like this happen where you live? The sleek black SUV had just turned out of the supermarket parking lot when the tires barely crossed the white line and a blaring siren erupted from behind. A patrol car sped forward, blocking the front of the vehicle with the kind of abrupt maneuver that suggested a level 3 pursuit had just concluded in the middle of the city. Lieutenant Travis Lorry leapt out of the driver's seat with the posture of a man who believed every black person was a walking target for random inspection. He didn't need an official reason. He only needed the feeling that he had enough authority to make someone stop. And in that very moment, his eyes landed on the woman seated in the front passenger seat. Brown skin, tightly coiled hair in a neat bun, a modest long dress that couldn't hide an uncommon self-assurance. He curled his lips into a sneer, muttering through clenched teeth, "Does this whole block need a lesson? Nice car. Doesn't really go with your skin tone, huh?" The woman didn't respond. She turned to look at him with such calm that it made him pause for half a second. She opened the door, carefully brushing her dress away from the edge of the muddy tire, then stood upright, arms gently resting at her sides, as if waiting for a more reasonable question. But Travis gave her no such chance. "License and registration," he ordered, his tone the same as one used on a caught criminal. "I'm not driving today," she replied. Her voice was soft, but not weak. "I was just dropped off here. I'm waiting for the driver to return from inside the store." The words didn't carry resistance, merely an explanation. But to Travis, it felt like a slap across his daily arrogance. He glanced into the car. The driver's seat was empty. The woman had been in the passenger's. No one else. He frowned, then curled that same smug grin. "So, am I talking to the car, or do you just think you're smarter than me?" Elise Whitaker remained still, showing no reaction. She didn't move, didn't justify, didn't hide anything, and that very composure only made Travis more irritated. He walked around to the passenger side, didn't ask permission, didn't speak, and flung the door open like executing a warranted search. With one careless movement, a cream-colored fabric bag tipped over on the seat and spilled its contents. A black lace undergarment dropped to the ground, lying exposed in the supermarket walkway. Elise didn't gasp. She bent down, retrieved the bag, zipped it closed, then stood straight again, eyes never leaving him. Travis folded his arms across his chest, posturing as if he was waiting for this woman to make her next mistake. But there was no mistake. She had done everything right. No haste, no overreaction, no excuse he could weaponize. And that unnerved him. He demanded, "What's your name?" "Elise Whitaker," she answered. He nodded slowly, as if memorizing a name to run through the system after dinner. But just as he pulled out his phone, about to request backup from dispatch, a voice called out from several yards away, "Hey, dumbass, you picked the wrong one." The voice wasn't loud, but it was enough to catch attention. A middle-aged woman stood under the shade near the store entrance, phone in hand, recording everything. Her face wasn't angry, just full of astonishment, laced with contempt. "I've seen her on TV. You'd better stop while you still can." Travis glanced over, squinting, almost shouted, but caught himself. He turned back toward Elise, trying to recover. "Your documents, right now." Elise quietly opened her purse, pulled out a zippered file envelope, but didn't hand it to him. She raised it to his eye level and asked, "Are you sure you want to see this document right here, right now, in front of everyone?" Her question wasn't defiant. It was a warning. But to Travis, it was a litmus test, forcing him to either back off or escalate. And, as usual, he chose to escalate. "Don't teach me how to do my job," he growled, snatching the envelope from her hand and opening it. But inside wasn't a license or standard registration. Only a matte deck ID card, no text, bearing the silver seal of the United States Department of Justice and a small red barcode in the bottom right corner. He had never seen a card like it before. He didn't understand what it meant, but he wouldn't show that. He stuffed it into his shirt pocket like it was incriminating evidence. A second car rolled up and parked behind the patrol car. A man stepped out in plain clothes, his face slightly tense. He didn't speak, only looked at Elise, then at Travis, then at the growing crowd. Elise turned to the man, gave a slight nod, then looked back at Travis and said in a voice soft but unmistakably firm, "I think from this point on, you should choose your words more carefully." Travis tightened his jaw, glaring at Elise as if she had just dared to challenge the power of a system he believed he represented. But in truth, that very system, if he understood what was happening, was already trembling from within because of this woman's presence. And in that fleeting moment, he felt something shift. Not the gears of law, not a formal command, but the gaze of the crowd, changing from curiosity to shock, from shock to indignation, from indignation to expectation. Everyone was waiting for something or someone to make them understand that stopping a vehicle today was no longer a matter of routine inspection. Travis said nothing more. He yanked Elise's wrist with his gloved hand, pulling hard as if escorting an armed robber caught in the act. The move was sudden, unannounced, baseless. The force of the tug spun Elise's body sideways, slamming it against the still warm hood of the SUV. The metallic thud echoed sharp and cold, like a verdict delivered without trial, a strike that required no weapon, only authority and contempt. He twisted her arm behind her back, rotating her right wrist, and, without hesitation, cuffed her using the same gray steel handcuffs he always carried on his hip, like a permanent emblem of discipline and punishment. Elise tilted her head slightly to the left to avoid having her face pressed entirely against the hood, but she didn't scream, didn't flinch. She only took a deep breath, as if she had known this moment would come. The sound of metal crashing against bare skin in the midday heat made a child nearby burst into tears. The boy couldn't have been older than 6, holding his mother's hand as they waited to enter the supermarket. His eyes widened in horror. Then he screamed as though it were his own arm being twisted behind his back. The mother hurriedly bent down, pulled him closer, one arm shielding his eyes, but it was too late. The image had burned into his memory, a woman who did not resist, being held down, manhandled, treated like a criminal simply for daring to remain silent in a society that favors submission. Travis gritted his teeth and leaned close to Elise's ear, his voice nearly a growl. "Out here, I am the law." His breath reeked of tobacco and arrogance. It was not a statement, it was a proclamation, a personal motto forged from years of impunity. Elise didn't turn to look. She couldn't. Her face was still pinned against the searing hot surface of the car, but she spoke, clear, deliberate, every word hammered into the conscience of anyone within earshot. "No, you're just an instrument. The law isn't in your hands. You're merely borrowing it." Her voice didn't rise, didn't crack, didn't tremble. It was soft, but cold, like a velvet curtain closing in front of someone who had just sneered, like a blade gliding across the neck before pain could register. Travis didn't respond, not because he had nothing to say, but because he couldn't comprehend how someone with her face pressed against a car, hands cuffed, publicly humiliated, could still speak like that without caving. He tightened the cuffs a bit more, as if trying to strangle whatever pride remained, not hers, but his own. A young man in the crowd stepped forward, still filming with his phone, shouting, "Hey, what are you doing? She didn't do anything. This is abuse of power in broad daylight." Travis raised his head, eyes bloodshot, and gestured to the officer behind him. The younger cop stepped up immediately, jabbing a finger into the man's chest. "Step back. Obstructing an officer is a criminal offense. You want to go to jail?" His tone was gruff, straight out of a policy handbook, but his face looked nervous, as if he, too, didn't understand what was happening, but felt compelled to follow orders. The young man stepped back, but didn't stop recording. His expression shifted from anger to wariness, full of suspicion. It felt like standing on the blurry line between truth and spectacle, between justice and farce. Elise was still pinned to the car, her shadow cast on the smudged window, warped by the blazing summer sun. But in that distortion, no one saw a woman broken. They saw someone who still carried the bearing of a person who knew the law, lived by the law, and once commanded a legal system that people like Travis would never reach. An older man, possibly a veteran, wearing a worn olive jacket, stepped closer, standing just at the edge of the crowd, and said in a low voice that somehow carried through the whole block, "I've seen her on TV. She testified before Congress. How do you not recognize her face?" Travis heard it. His face twitched. His hand loosened slightly, then pulled back, not letting Elise go, but stepping back half a pace, just enough to hide the sudden unease. He glanced at the man, then at the crowd slowly closing in. More phones were raised. Eyes once curious had turned furious, and in the center, Elise stood upright after being hauled to her feet. Hands cuffed behind her back, hair disheveled from being forced down, but her face bore no sign of victimhood. There were no tears, no pleas, no curse words, only presence. And that presence alone was enough to push someone like Travis to the edge. He turned to his subordinate and muttered, "Call for backup, document noncompliance, and draft a refusal to cooperate report." He needed an excuse, a way to cover the widening gap between what he had just done and what the crowd had just witnessed. But what report could distort the eyes of dozens? The paperwork could erase the sight of a woman being slammed onto the hood of a car in broad daylight without a clear offense. Elise turned her head, slowly, hampered by the cuffs, but her gaze locked directly onto Travis's. There was no fire, no vengeance. Only a line that made the air around them tighten like a noose. "You've just made a mistake. This system won't be able to undo." Travis didn't answer, but this time it wasn't because he didn't want to, it was because he didn't dare. Elise's words still lingered in the air like an unfamiliar scent. Not overpowering, but sinking into every cell of the crowd. "You've just made a mistake this system won't be able to undo." Travis remained motionless, as if even he had heard something that didn't belong to this world. Not a siren, not a voice, but the sound of a power vein beginning to constrict, to clog, because of a reckless decision now captured from 12 different angles. Elise didn't struggle, didn't scream, didn't ask for a lawyer. She didn't posture as a martyr or lash out in search of pity. She simply stood, hands cuffed behind her back, like someone who knew exactly where her body was being pressed and exactly how intact her spirit remained. Her eyes didn't scan for allies, didn't wait for a savior. They focused directly on the man temporarily holding the upper hand, as if he were merely a side character who had wandered mistakenly onto a political stage never meant for him. Travis clenched his throat, stepped closer. "You think you can sue me?" The question wasn't asked to be answered. It was a jab, meant to drain the self-respect of whoever stood in front of him. But Elise didn't flinch. She tilted her head slightly, just enough to maintain the thread of air between them. Her voice dropped, not quite a whisper, but sharp as a razor. "I'm not suing. I'm just signing the investigation order." That sentence wasn't long, but it was enough to make Travis pause for half a second, a small hesitation, yet enough for the crowd to recognize that the officer had been struck in a blind spot. Signing the investigation order. No one used that phrase lightly. No one. Unless they truly had the authority to do so. And if that were true, then he wasn't just wrong. He had laid his entire career on an operating table where the victim held the scalpel. A young supermarket security guard, face tense but still clinging to a sliver of professional conscience, stepped out from the revolving door, raising both hands as if to de-escalate. "Sorry, but I think maybe we should." He didn't finish his sentence before Travis snapped his head around and barked, "Freeze, if you don't want to lose your job." The outburst made the young man pale, stepping back like a schoolboy wrongly punished, eyes welling up as justice was throttled before it could speak. Elise didn't smile, but she leaned just slightly to glance at a black metal watch partially visible under the sleeve of her ash-gray blazer. Her eyes flicked across the dial like one reviewing a familiar case file. A soft breath escaped. 3 minutes earlier than expected. Interesting. The words weren't directed at anyone specific, not loud enough for the crowd to hear clearly, but they echoed like a coded signal, as if someone had just confirmed the timing of a long calculated strike. Travis didn't fully catch the remark, but Elise's gaze unsettled him. He had arrested many people, subdued others in the street, slammed faces into scorching pavement, but never had someone looked at him like that. No one had ever let him cuff them while standing, as though he were the one being bound. No one had ever endured his insults without shedding tears, without flinching, without begging, and this wasn't defiance either. Elise wasn't defiant. She was in control. She was calculating. She was counting his every breath as if transcribing a log of sins in real time before they even occurred. Travis felt heat swelling in his throat, not from the sun, but from the tension in his body, straining to maintain a position that was rapidly collapsing. He turned, signaling his deputy to document the vehicle, to log the license plate as justification for a citation. But deep within, something began to surface, something deeper than doubt, bordering on fear, though he wasn't ready to call it that. Elise said nothing more, but her face, her stance, her presence, they all formed a silent test for Travis. Did he have the capacity to recognize who was standing before him? Could he distinguish between an innocent person and a symbol of power that bore no flag, no badge, no podium? More importantly, could he grasp that every second he kept her in cuffs was another second tightening the noose around his own neck? As Travis opened his mouth, perhaps to order her transported, perhaps to issue a final threat, a woman in the crowd shouted, "Take your hands off her! I've seen her on TV. I know who she is. Don't play dumb, you fool!" Her scream landed like a slap across Travis's face, right in front of dozens of eyes now fixed on him. Some glared with fury. Some watched with pity, but the most chilling were those who stared coldly, not afraid, not surprised, just seething with contempt. And at the center of it all, Elise remained unmoved. She didn't resist because she didn't need to. When someone understands exactly how the system works, she doesn't need to scream in the street to prove she's right. She only needs to remain silent and let those who think they own the law walk themselves into its judgment. Travis clenched his jaw, pulled his personal phone from his pocket, and moved with the speed of someone who had memorized every possible way to find a crack in anyone he'd ever pulled over. He opened the Internal Records Retrieval app, a privilege reserved only for mid-level officers and above. His fingers tapped aggressively on the search bar. Elise Whitaker, he punched in, each letter like stabbing them, as if he could punish the name just by spelling it out again and again. He hit the confirm button, waiting for the screen to pull up. Address, license, violation history, credit traces, insurance ID, current employment, everything he could weaponize to break a person right there on the street. But when the query loaded, the screen returned something he had never seen in 12 years on the force. A line of bold red text. No underline, no blinking, just resting still but reading, like an indictment, hurled straight at his face. Access denied. Clearance level 9. Travis froze, thumb still on the screen, the blood gone from his fingertips. He stared at the phrase as if it were written in an ancient language he didn't want to understand but had no choice but to comprehend. Level 9? That clearance level didn't exist in standard procedure. It was outside anything he had been trained for. His entire precinct had only one person ever granted Level 7 access, the precinct chief, and even he once said, from Level 8 upward, every access must be signed off by the Federal Internal Affairs Office. And yet now, a woman he had just pinned to the hood of a car triggered a system response like someone was trying to breach top-secret federal records. He tried to hold a straight face, but his wrist trembled slightly. To cover it, he turned to his deputy. Run her name through the second channel. Then he dialed extended support himself. The dispatch answered quickly, like always, but this time, instead of the usual security prompts, a recorded female voice came through, even and icy cold. Access denied, request redirected for internal review. 4 seconds later, The call cut off. A line appeared on screen, redirecting to DOJ Internal Authentication Hub. Travis had never even heard of that, and he had never been booted from the system like this before. It didn't feel like a technical glitch. It felt like the system knew exactly who he was and was actively blocking him from what he wasn't worthy to know. Another officer approached, peeking at the screen. He was young, possibly recently transferred from another district. His face was clean, still marked with inexperience, but his eyes were sharp. When he saw the red text, his expression froze for a few seconds. Then, as if on instinct, he stepped back, gripping his radio strap tighter, throat swallowing dry. No one needed to say anything. He had just realized that the woman standing in the street, handcuffed for no clear reason, had access or belonged to a classification that the entire department had never touched. Elise still hadn't said a word. She didn't need to. The truth was surfacing on its own, and that silence was the strongest blow. Travis spun around, striding toward Elise. Sunlight spilled over her hair, catching the silver strands scattered through the black. Not signs of aging, but marks left by someone who had sat through too many hearings, too many interrogations, never needing to raise her voice to be heard. "Who are you?" Travis asked. For the first time during the entire incident, his voice no longer bitter, no longer mocking, just a real question. Elise turned her head, looked him straight in the eye. No smile, no emotion. She spoke a single sentence, soft as mist but sharp as a blade. "You're not authorized to see me." It hit him like a punch to the face. A name he couldn't trace. No strike lands harder than a truth the powerful can't comprehend. He didn't ask anything else, didn't take another step. Everything inside him was strangled by the very system he had thought he controlled. In his mind now was a tangle of confusion. If she was someone important, why was she here? If she was no one, why was the system afraid of her? At that very moment, from a distance, a jet-black civilian vehicle approached. No siren, no lights, no government tags, but the silver trim on the side mirrors, the reflective coating on the body. Only those who'd escorted high-ranking officials before would recognize this wasn't a civilian car. A man in a gray button-down shirt stepped out from the passenger seat, walking toward them without urgency. His eyes didn't search for Travis. He only looked at Elise, then gave her a slight nod. Elise didn't return the gesture, but she turned, extended her cuffed hands behind her back, as if preparing to be uncuffed. Travis stayed still. He didn't ask anything more, but his hand instinctively tightened around the clasp at his belt. He watched the man approach, then glanced back at the silent crowd. People were still recording, still watching, still waiting. But now they weren't waiting for the woman in handcuffs to scream. They were waiting to see which man had just made a mistake he couldn't undo. No sirens, no loudspeakers, no headline crawling across the evening news. Everything needed for a shift in public opinion was already happening, right now, in silence, through lenses smaller than the palm of a hand but heavier than a federal warrant. The crowd was no longer just a group of bystanders. They had become a collective of witnesses, each person a link in a chain, each device a beam of light, and all of them now pointed directly at Lieutenant Travis Lorry, the man who had just handcuffed a woman who had committed no crime, offered no resistance, yet triggered a systemic response as if the state were facing a top-level threat. A popular TikToker, wearing dark sunglasses, a hoodie, muttering non-stop, was live-streaming from the right corner of the parking lot. He angled the camera upward, capturing the exact moment Elise stood upright, with her hands cuffed, her black hair catching sunlight, while Travis stood behind her, his face locked in a tense grimace, like a man trapped in a chess game whose rules he didn't know. The live stream title blazed below, bold against a red background. Karen Kopp loses it with the wrong black queen. Justice Watch. Duawa. In less than 40 seconds after the stream started, the viewer count surpassed 30,000, and the share rate ticked upward like the heartbeat of the crowd. Elisa didn't fully turn her head, but her eyes glanced to the left, right, where the TikToker's lens was aimed. That look wasn't startled, didn't avoid, and certainly didn't evade. It was the look of someone who had stood in front of cameras mounted on congressional podiums, who had heard her name echo through Senate microphones, who had signed off on legislation that forced hundreds of officers to rewrite their entire protocol. She held that gaze for a second, then turned back to Travis, her voice low and slow but with the force of a verdict sealed by a judge's gavel. This you should watch again in court. No one burst out laughing, no one clapped, but the crowd began to murmur. The murmurs twisted together, swirling in the air like smoke from a just-fired gun. A teenage girl in a baseball cap turned to her friend. "Court? What kind of court could even handle this?" The TikToker didn't stop streaming. He just mumbled, "Oh shit, this guy's done for." A few yards away, unnoticed by most, inside a mobile broadcasting van, parked across the street, a specialized lens began to rotate. Local news station KLBN 8, originally there to film a piece on food prices, was now, accidentally, capturing a story that could impact the state's entire budget if aired during prime time. A technician had hit record at the first sound of argument, and now no one inside the cabin dared stop the feed. They stared at the monitor and saw the image, a handcuffed woman, not resisting, causing a police officer to back off, not through force, but through something greater, a kind of power that made no sound, but everyone could feel it. And then, from the edge of the parking lot, the middle-aged woman from the opening scene, the one who muttered, "You messed with the wrong one, dumbass," now stood silently with her phone to her ear. Her voice was low but firm, and if anyone had heard it, it would have sent chills down their spine. "Initiate Protocol P7. I see her." No one knew what Protocol P7 was, but the way she said it, like flipping the switch on a long-dormant political earthquake, made the very air seem to contract. Elise remained still. She didn't yank her arms. She didn't look back. She didn't deliver some grand speech to seize the moment. But that stillness alone made it impossible for the cameras to look away. When someone can remain in control while handcuffed and surrounded, they don't need to scream to prove they're right. They only need to stand and let the system reveal itself as wrong. Travis turned toward the crowd. The eyes staring back at him were no longer confused, no longer afraid. They were transforming, from bystanders into witnesses, from recorders into accusers. He saw it clearly, and he knew this time no one would erase the footage, no media team could manage the context. He was being stripped bare before the public, not by scandal but by his own demeanor, his contempt, and his habit of choosing power over principle. A soft ping rang from the TikToker's phone. He looked down, then shouted, "Major outlet just shared the clip. Fox News retweeted it." In under 10 minutes, from a minor handcuffing incident at Elkhorn Market's parking lot, the event had blown past Montana's borders, landing squarely on the desks of editors in New York and Washington, D.C. And through it all, Elise said nothing more, because she understood this system doesn't fear the truth. It only fears a truth that has an audience. The murmurs in the crowd hadn't yet died down when Elise leaned slightly toward Travis. Her hands were still cuffed, but her posture showed no submission. There was no plea in her movement, no trace of resistance. Only a single sentence was released, soft, just enough for him to hear, but it cut through his throat like a silent blade, ripping apart the last thread of confidence in an officer who believed himself in control. "You have 10 minutes to call your superior. If you don't, the consequences will be beyond anyone's control." Travis turned to her, squinting. He tilted his head to one side, sneering, voice dragging with mockery. "Who are you counting down for? Your lawyer boyfriend?" He let out a dry laugh, the kind of laugh belonging to a man still convinced the game was in his hands. He saw no reason to entertain a threat from a handcuffed woman in the middle of the street, no matter how well-spoken she might be. To him, it was just another act, and he had seen hundreds like it, from all shades of skin across more than a decade of duty. What he didn't know was, this time, He wasn't watching a performance. He was standing in front of a system already locked and loaded, and he had just pulled the trigger. Elise didn't respond. She no longer looked at him. She simply nodded, as if syncing time with something far beyond the present moment. The nod wasn't submission, it was a signal that had been programmed, remembered, and replaced inside a system Travis could never access with his county-level authority. And just as he lingered in the smug grin of his own arrogance, a low, heavy engine rumbled from the distance. An armored black vehicle crept forward. Silent, no sirens, no flashing lights, but its mere presence changed the air on impact. Its windows were coated in gray reflective film, impossible to see through. On the rear left window was a faint circular emblem, the blurred insignia of the United States Department of Justice, recognized only by those who had worked deep enough within the system to know what that symbol meant. It was not for public display. It was for those with the power to halt an entire state's administrative apparatus for an hour if necessary. The crowd stirred again. A young man in business attire whispered to someone beside him without taking his eyes off Elise. "I've seen her before, during the hearing on banking crimes, in Congress." Before his companion could respond, another voice cut in from behind. Deep, raspy, but resolute. The voice of someone who had seen actual combat, a veteran. He wasn't in uniform, but his face bore the marks of years spent in a system where laws were more than ink and books. They were his. As they walked to the end of the courthouse, he stepped up beside Travis, didn't touch him, just leaned slightly and spoke in a tone only they could hear. "I once took orders from her during the joint operation between DOJ and the Pentagon in 2013. You just pulled the trigger without checking your target." Travis froze for a moment, not because the old man had threatened him, but because that reference to 2013 struck a memory he'd once brushed past during a special training session, an internal investigation that had led to the removal of 2 police commanders at the same time. No press conference, no public charges. They vanished from the system like they'd never existed. Every document had been stamped classified. At the time, Travis's superior had said only one thing: some people don't need court. They are the court. He never imagined the woman standing in front of him could be one of them. Impossible. It couldn't be. The black vehicle had stopped. The doors remained closed. No one got out. But its presence alone was a reminder. Time was passing, and the clock was not in the hands of a man who thought himself sheriff of a supermarket parking lot. Elise tilted her head, glanced at the vehicle for a second, then turned back to Travis. No smile, no further comment. None needed. Every sign had been given. The spectators, both online and in person, were witnessing it. They were no longer asking, "What's happening?" They had started asking, "Who is this woman?" And once that question surfaced, every PR campaign, every excuse, every internal memo became meaningless. Travis was rattled. He had never felt this before. One hand still rested on his belt, the other gripped his radio tightly. But he didn't know who to call. There was no command code for this situation. No SOP covered what to do when a handcuffed woman on the street had access that exceeded even the precinct chief. He could release her, but that would be an admission of guilt. He could keep her, but that would be a declaration of war against a system he didn't even know the level of. The vehicle remained still. Elise remained handcuffed, but now the street no longer looked at her as someone detained. They looked at her like a live grenade, pin pulled. And they looked at Travis as the man holding it, not realizing it was about to explode. 1 second after the armored black vehicle came to a stop and the silence on the street froze over, another police officer, part of the area's support unit, recently dispatched following a secondary-level backup request, approached from the left side of the scene. He was young, his face still bright, his features unwrinkled by years of being swallowed in the game of power, like Travis. But the moment his eyes landed on the woman standing cuffed in the middle of the street, now the focal point of every lens, he halted, not out of confusion, but because he recognized her. Elise Whitaker, a name known only to those who had been selected to attend federal-level training sessions, but once heard, could never be forgotten. His face visibly paled, his hands trembled slightly. The gun on his hip suddenly felt twice as heavy. He inhaled sharply as if to confirm the truth, then quickly removed his hat and stepped toward Elise. His expression completely altered, from confidence to disbelief, from disbelief to a reverence verging on disarray. But Elise simply shook her head. No words, no movement, just a subtle gesture, full of meaning. Do not intervene. Do not excuse. Do not disrupt the order she had already set in motion. The young officer froze, as if hypnotized. He took no further steps. He said nothing more, but his eyes betrayed what he couldn't suppress, an overwhelming confusion and a quietly growing respect that now swelled inside him. He turned away without hesitation, pulled out his internal comms device. He didn't call the main dispatch. He didn't message the district command center. He dialed a sequence known only within the system, 378 Alpha. That was the direct code for Federal Coordination Room 3, an elite division of the DOJ that received orders only from regional directors or higher. The response from the other end came not in a voice, but a deep, mechanical tone. Channel open. Location: Elkhorn Valley, Ridge Central Supermarket parking lot. Whitaker present. Authentication code: November Victor 30 on Beta. No follow-up questions, no requests for verification, no please hold, only one clipped reply: acknowledged, and the line went dead. At that exact moment, inside the black SUV no more than 30 feet away, the recessed digital clock in the dashboard began to glow. No siren, no flashing emergency light, just a single red line, quietly sliding across the screen like a horizon splitting open. It was a synchronized security monitor, a device installed in vehicles assigned to high-level political personnel, activated only when detecting direct threat behavior against individuals listed under Level 1 Extended Protection Protocols. That single red swipe marked the moment the central system recorded the subject was under inappropriate administrative level threat. From that second onward, all visual, audio, and environmental data surrounding Elise was encrypted under Internal Emergency Protocol and streamed back to Regional Command Center 3. Travis still didn't understand. He saw the young officer, who had removed his hat, now standing 10 paces away, silent but visibly shaken. He noticed the black SUV had shifted in status somehow, though he heard no distinct sound, and he saw that the crowd was no longer restless because of physical actions, but stilled by something larger unfolding quietly, something no one could yet explain. Elise didn't need to raise her voice. The system had already spoken for her. The young officer looked at Elise again, something in his eyes, a silent apology, a truth caught in his throat. But Elise didn't let that pass unnoticed. She turned to look at him, her gaze steady and warm, her voice just loud enough to pierce the moment's stillness. "I'll remember your eyes, even if you never spoke." The words settled in the midday heat, slipping through stares and camera lenses, embedding themselves somewhere in the young officer's memory like a crossroad. A choice: to remain silent or to be the last one who still knew how to tell right from wrong. Travis began to feel the one sensation he hated most: the loss of control. He pressed his radio to call for backup, but no one responded. He pulled up his call list to reach the county station chief, but the line was unavailable. While he fumbled, the SUV's headlights dimmed to a soft internal glow, the setting used exclusively when a site was about to fall under Level 3 coordinated federal control. Travis didn't recognize those signals, but he recognized this feeling, the feeling of someone who had crossed a line and was now being quietly removed by powers above his reach. Elise said nothing more. She simply stood, still cuffed in a parking lot under dozens of watching eyes, but she remained the center of order. Every movement now orbited her, the codes, the frequencies, the coordination signals, none of it visible but all in motion, activated to protect something that Travis could no longer control. He hadn't just made a mistake, he had triggered a chain of responses he no longer had the authority to stop. The moment the atmosphere thickened from the security signal emitted by Elise's vehicle, the entire parking lot seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something no one could name, but everyone could feel, the sensation of a turning point, not heralded by sirens, not stirred by a panicked crowd, but by the blood-draining silence of men who had once believed themselves untouchable. And then, within that silence, the crackle of Travis's radio burst out, urgent, frantic, like the heartbeat of a man about to fall into a trap of his own making. All units stand down. Emergency code FQ01 now active. The voice did not pass through the usual filters. It was the voice of an interregional commander, someone who would never directly intervene on site unless the situation had spiraled beyond the control of the entire district chain of command. The parking lot fell a full degree colder. The words FQ01 slammed into Travis's temple, but he didn't understand. What was that code? Why had he never seen it in the procedural manual? He hit the reply button, his voice hoarse, as if clinging to whatever scraps of authority he had left. What is FQ code? Who authorized this order? He couldn't hide the bitterness. He needed an explanation. He was the officer in charge. How could there be a code that bypassed him? The reply came instantly, without pause. The voice, clinical and absolute, shot back, FQ is the Emergency Response Protocol for Region 3 personnel under federal protection. It outranks you by 3 levels. No authorization signature required. Release her. Immediately. Just 4 sentences. But each one severed another joint of dignity, still clinging to the uniform Travis was wearing. He didn't ask further. He didn't dare. Because to ask meant to hear more truth, and this time he was the one under scrutiny. He swallowed hard and looked up at Elise, still standing in the middle of the lot, her hands cuffed, not shouting, not resisting, but somehow commanding the entire police force without uttering a single directive. Elise leaned away slowly. No one helped her. No one dared. She rose from the hood of the car, where just minutes earlier Travis had pinned her face with the full weight of his contempt. And now, she, still with hands restrained behind her back, was the one halting an entire system's function. No accusations, no bitterness, just her presence, and it was more than enough to make any clear-headed person realize some people do not need a courtroom because they are the court. The atmosphere hadn't recovered when another SUV skidded to a halt along the curb. A middle-aged man emerged, uniformed in dark gray, face slick with sweat, collar flipped from haste. The precinct police chief, Travis's former direct superior, a man who hadn't shown up to any low-level scene in the past 3 years, now rushing forward like a beast jolted awake in the middle of an earthquake, now wheeling and lurching in the tunnel. "Lord Travis, do you even know what you've just done?" he shouted, throwing decorum to the wind, not waiting for the crowd to move aside. His voice carried fury, panic, and a fear so vivid it cracked with every note. Elise still didn't speak, but she turned her head to the chief, just for 1 second. A glance that wasn't threatening, but still made the man pause, as if slapped. His breathing turned ragged, unable to keep his posture. His chest heaved, each breath like a silent plea, a desperate hope that one more news headline wouldn't be the death knell for his career and for every officer under his command. Travis was different. He didn't understand the codes, but he understood the eyes of the people recording. He understood the eyes of the young officer who had removed his hat, and he understood that this time there would be no revised reports, no procedural clarification. He had gone too far, and the very cuffs he had clamped on Elisa's wrists were now locking his own fate into a disciplinary file that would hit the Department of the Interior in less than 10 minutes. Elise turned. Her hands were still bound, but her stance remained upright, never once broken. No one came forward to unlock her. But everyone knew, if she so much as spoke a word, every lock in this block would melt away on its own. And perhaps it was precisely because she said nothing that the fear ran deeper. Her silence was an indictment. that needed no words. No one unlocked the cuffs. No official order was issued, but everyone understood. Elise Whitaker did not need to wait for someone to set her free. It was her silence that was slowly dismantling each lock in a system once believed unshakable. Not with her hands, but with the silent pressure rippling through levels of power people like Travis would never see. And before that silence had even dissipated, a signal blinked inside Elise's SUV, quiet as breath, yet enough to rewrite the entire event record within 8 seconds. A digital black box, the kind installed only in vehicles assigned to senior DOJ personnel, shifted into live data transmission mode. Everything, the cameras, microphones, and sensors within a 5-meter radius of the vehicle had recorded over the past 7 minutes, was encrypted, split into 3 distinct data packets, and uploaded to a secure private network. One packet went to the United States Department of Justice. One went to the NAACP office in Washington. The final one, titled Incident Elkhorn V, was sent directly to CNN via the same internal server used in the Ferguson investigation years ago. The upload was nearly instantaneous. While Travis was still struggling between saving face and escaping fallout, the truth had already landed in the hands of those capable of reshaping national public opinion with a single headline. Travis then heard another transmission from the radio. This time it wasn't from the regional commander. It was a wide broadcast sent directly to all active law enforcement phones operating within the Elkhorn Valley security grid. On every screen, a single line of text appeared, accompanied by a sharp chime like a blade drawn clean. Do not engage. VIP infield. No explanation. No clarification, no verification request, just a single negation, and with that, every reactive authority was stripped from the hands of each officer on site. In one instant, their guns, cuffs, badges, and even their voices were rendered null, because in the language of the system, VIP in field meant the person present was no longer a subject to enforce the law upon, but the embodiment of it. A phone rang. Not from the station chief, not from the district, but from the state's administrative director, a figure who had never personally called down to local levels for anything below a Tier 5 emergency. The call did not go through internal dispatch, but was routed directly to the precinct commander's secure line, currently in Travis's possession, because the commander was in a meeting in a neighboring town. A screen displayed, line point, secret/interface. Yes, sir, Travis answered, unable to hide the tension in his eyes, even as he kept his face blank. The male voice on the other end was hoarse and trembling, as if forcing each word out with effort. Stay silent. Release her. Do not say another word. No pause for response. No, yes, sir. The call ended immediately. It was an order that did not permit conversation. Travis stood there, hand clenched near his belt, lips pressed tight as if trying to swallow a storm pounding in his skull. He had never been neutralized like this. Not by violence, not by a lawyer, but by a chain of orders from levels too high to name, each one slicing through the sinews of power he once believed he controlled. He didn't understand it all, but he could feel it. This time, no one was standing with him, not the system, not even the law he used to invoke to crush others beneath his authority. Elise turned her head, her gaze gentle but sharp, as if delivering a suspended sentence. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to mock. Just one sentence, spoken with a near-invisible smile on her lips. They're not saving me. They're saving you. Travis said nothing, but that sentence landed in his chest like a silent spear. They're not saving her? True, because she had never needed saving. She was never the one at risk. He was, the one with the cuffs in his hand, the radio at his chest, the uniform on his body, the very system he thought he owned, was now trying desperately to shield before he got torn apart. A young officer, just receiving the alert on his phone, quietly removed the radio from his chest, took out the battery, and slid it into his pocket like a silent ritual of resignation. An administrative worker passing Elise's vehicle glanced at the blinking black box, then nodded softly, as if confirming he now understood he was no longer someone who held the facts. They all began to fall silent, but not with the silence of defeat, with the silence of people who realized they had stepped into a battle that was never meant for their rank. Travis remained where he stood, the cuffs still locked around Elise's wrists, but the control was no longer in his hands, and perhaps it never was. As Elise finished her sentence, the atmosphere froze once again. "They're not saving me, they're saving you." Those standing nearby heard every word, and no one dared ask for clarification. There was nothing left to ask. Everything that needed to be understood was already there, in Elise's gaze and in the trembling silence behind Travis's eyes. The 4 words, VIP in field, were still displayed across dozens of phones. The radios remained silent. Communications stayed blocked, but no one needed another signal. Everyone already knew. And then, just as the silence stretched 1 second longer, threatening to suffocate the entire town, the rear door of the black SUV opened. A man stepped out. His black tailored suit held not a single wrinkle, large sunglasses covered nearly half his face, and his black leather gloves fit like diplomatic gear. No one knew his name, but no one needed to, because the object he pulled from his inner breast pocket and raised firmly said everything, every title, every rank, every level of authority that no uniformed officer present dared question. A golden badge, shimmering with a metallic finish, with deep-fetched letters that read Federal Special Operations Coordinator. On the back of the badge, a raised DEO insignia, along with a deep access code, LV9A. Didn't need to speak, but he did. His voice was low and sharp, like a scalpel slicing through the ignorance Travis had just put on full display. "Remove the cuffs, now, and bow your head when she walks away." Just one sentence, no shouting, no threats, but each word slammed into the spines of every officer standing there. Travis didn't move. His eyes reddened, not from anger, but from the realization that what he was feeling now wasn't mere it was the collapse of power. He froze, his tongue rigid as stone. He had placed those cuffs on Elise's wrists, and now he had to take them off. But the one thing he couldn't unlock was the verdict, already written silently over the past 10 minutes, written in the eyes of the crowd, and the avalanche of tweets crashing down like a storm. Elise didn't flinch. She held her cuffed hands in place. No lowering, no twisting, no bowing her head. A young officer approached with trembling hands, having received direct orders from the man in the black suit. He pulled out the key, inhaled deeply, and slid it into the lock. The soft click echoed like wind, but inside Travis's skull, it rang like a funeral bell. Elise gently withdrew her hands. She didn't look back at Travis. She didn't need to, because at this point, the only thing keeping him upright was a shred of dignity, already scorched to the bone. The DOJ official stepped forward, pulled a neatly folded coat from inside his jacket, and handed it to Elise with both hands. She received it, draped it over her shoulders. The coat, long enough to brush her knees, wasn't for warmth. It was the final layer of armor, worn exactly at the moment of revelation. Elise stepped onto the vehicle's running board, slow, steady steps, like someone entering the most important press briefing in the country. But she paused for a beat, turned and looked straight at Travis. Not angry, not mocking, not pitiful. Her voice floated out like a breeze, but sliced through the air like cold steel. "Hold on to this until you learn how to respect it." Then she turned away, leaving him holding the cuffs. Once a symbol of power, now the most vivid piece of evidence in the downfall he had just authored. The crowd didn't clap, but no one left. They stood still, as if witnessing a ritual too great for a small-town parking lot. A little girl standing beside her mother, clutching a pink canvas tote, suddenly shouted, as if she could no longer hold it in, "She's the one who helped my mom get out of jail when she was innocent." The sentence rang out without script, unprompted, but it struck like a stone dropped into a lake whose surface had only temporarily calmed. The murmurs began again, this time coalescing into clearer whispers. The name Elise Whitaker began to circulate in different tones from different corners of the lot. Some remembered faded headlines from 2 years ago. when a black woman challenged the State Investigation Bureau over a mishandled case involving a female student in Jacksonville. Others recognized her face from a congressional hearing on victims of sexual assault by Highway Patrol, and still others, simply by watching the way she walked, understood this wasn't someone who came here to be released. She came here to prove that some mistakes can never again be hidden behind a uniform. On social media, the first tweet from the original clip passed 30 million views in 6 minutes. The hashtag, #WrongWomanRightPower, surged to #1 on national trends within 12 minutes. From MSNBC and CBS to Al Jazeera, anchors began analyzing the moment Elise turned and said her final words. CNN launched an emergency roundtable, recounting her resume. Elise Whitaker, former Federal Legal Operations Director at the United States Department of Justice, specializing in investigations of human rights violations committed by law enforcement. The question posed, why was someone like her handcuffed in Elkhorn Valley? The answer wasn't in a news broadcast. It was in the eyes of the thousands watching. No longer as spectators, they were witnesses. They were the new system, and they had just seen one truth. Identity isn't in a badge, it's in how a person is treated and in the posture they hold when the entire country is watching. On MSNBC's live broadcast, the anchor's face hovered beside a frozen frame. Elise Whitaker, pinned to the hood of a car, wrists tightly cuffed behind her back, her eyes shedding no tears, begging for nothing. On the contrary, her gaze was as sharp as a mirror-line blade, not to resist, but to reflect. To reflect a truth America could no longer avoid. Some people are born to lead, even when they're being trampled, and some are born to trample, until the cowardice in their veins is finally exposed. Exactly 8 minutes and 26 seconds after the first tweet, CNN cut straight to a breaking report titled, "DOJ Director Handcuffed. System in Question." Hundreds of thousands of eyes locked in, millions of hearts clenched, as Elise turned her head, still cuffed, and delivered a final line that needed no court to be a verdict. Hold on to this until you learn how to respect it. Fox News, usually skilled at shaping the narrative, couldn't redirect this one. A seasoned anchor slammed the desk and declared, "We are not looking at a victim. This is someone who once oversaw the entire federal investigative network, and she just got handcuffed in a parking lot like she was a nobody." The white experts in the studio didn't laugh, didn't deflect, because the very system they once trusted had just exposed its racial unconscious on national television. The NAACP released a statement less than 30 minutes after the video went viral. The incident at Elkhorn Valley is not merely misconduct by an individual. It's a test, and this nation's policing system failed at first glance. They posted a photo of Elise from a congressional hearing the year prior, standing mid-session, holding documents in her hand, locking eyes with a row of conservative senators, with the same gaze as today, a gaze that never backed down. In a small bar in Houston, dozens of black patrons held their breath, watching live updates. A silver-haired woman quietly wept as CNN's lower third scrolled across the screen. Who is she? Elise Whitaker. What does she do? Forces the entire system to confront itself. Twitter became an electronic battlefield. Each tweet was a shard of glass, reflecting the soul. From civil rights activists to everyday citizens, everyone was asking the same question. If someone like her can be cuffed in broad daylight, who among us is truly safe? Under the hashtag #WrongWomanRightPower, journalists, scholars, and victims of police violence began sharing their stories, not just with words, but with images, with data, with evidence. Elise wasn't alone, and she was no longer just an individual. She had become a spark. On TikTok, clips looped over and over the moment Travis yelled into Elise's face, "I'm the law here," only to be met with a calm response that sounded like a federal indictment. "No. You're just a tool." The video racked up 25 million views within the first 3 hours. People weren't watching to laugh. They watched to feel fury, to remember, and to never forget who stood tall, even when pinned down. MSNBC hosted a roundtable featuring 3 former Justice Department officials. One trembled as he read aloud the access code Travis had seen on the system. Access denied, clearance level 9. He shook his head. I've never seen anyone outside the top brass at CIA or DOJ hold level 9 clearance. And she was the one in cuffs? A veteran investigative journalist from NPR added. Travis didn't just arrest the wrong person. He cuffed an entire institution he never even understood. Those words needed no commentary. They landed like a judge's gavel in a courtroom of public opinion, where there's no appeal, only truth torn open. Facebook and Instagram overflowed with images of Elise, but not of her in cuffs. People dug up congressional hearings, speeches, past sightings where Elise appeared like a specter in police corruption investigations. Every image was another puzzle piece in constructing a new symbol, someone who didn't need a podium, only a straight spine. The media didn't stop at analyzing the event. They began digging. A ProPublica article headlined, Who allowed the system to forget its own highest watchdog? An op-ed in The Atlantic described Elise as the fault line between real power and performative power, because she didn't need to scream, didn't need to announce herself. She just stood there, cuffed, and made an entire nation re-examine itself. That very night, the front pages of both the Washington Post and the New York Times were changed. No more primary elections. No more inflation fears, just a single bold line across the center. One pair of handcuffs, and a nation unmasked. Meanwhile, in a holding cell, Travis growled at the only attorney who'd agreed to meet with him. Over one black bitch and the whole system goes insane? He spat, eyes ablaze. The lawyer stared at him, saying nothing, because the madness wasn't in the system, it was in the way Travis still believed he had control over anything, when in truth, he was merely the first name on hundreds of articles titled, How Arrogance Became the Blade That Cut Its Own Badge. In a high school classroom in Georgia, a civics teacher decided to change her lesson plan at the last minute. On the projection screen, she played the clip of Elise's arrest, pausing on the frame where she stood up from the hood of the car. The teacher asked the class, Do you see anyone in this image who holds power? Silence. Then a student replied, The woman in cuffs, because she didn't need anyone to unlock her and still made everyone afraid. Elise gave no speech, posted no tweet, granted no interview. But the media didn't need her words anymore. They needed the image. They needed the symbol. And they had it, not through glory, but through a moment of utter humiliation, followed by the simple act of straightening her coat and walking away like someone who writes the law. Every system, when it reaches its limit, creates a fracture, and through that fracture, either light breaks in or truth floods out. Elkhorn Valley that day didn't just create an incident, it blew open a door men like Travis never believed anyone would dare walk through. And Elise, with cuffs still on, was the first to step through, silently. But the whole world was screaming for her. Not a single statement, not a single interview came from Elise Whitaker following the media explosion, but the fourth-floor door of the Federal Coordination Bureau reopened after being sealed shut for nearly 1 year. Inside, Elise walked between rows of files, her black heels echoing rhythmically on the stone floor like the pulse of a machine just reactivated. Precise, cold, carrying no trace of personal sentiment, not a word of complaint, not a furrow of the brow. She had not returned for revenge. She had returned to calculate every margin of error the system had allowed to slip through, starting with Travis. In the Regional Security Coordination Room, 3 technicians were waiting in a near-breathless state. Elise sat down, opened the code board, and typed the command requesting full extraction of video and audio data from the Elkhorn Valley Police Department surveillance system covering the 24 hours surrounding the incident. She needed no guidance, no assistance. She selected each footage segment herself, rewinding and fast-forwarding with a fluency so unnervingly sharp it chilled the room. She said nothing, only touching the screen when she paused on the segment where Travis blocked the SUV and unilaterally opened the passenger door, letting a bag of personal belongings fall to the ground like a thrown gauntlet at someone's dignity. Elise did not frown, did not unmute the audio, but her eyes paused 1 second longer than usual, just enough for the technician to know that she had mentally nailed that detail into the record, like an iron spike. She tapped the keyboard lightly, moving on to footage from the central processing room, where Travis later submitted his initial report. Elise opened the accompanying audio file. His voice came through the system. The subject exhibited uncooperative behavior, refused to present identification, and demonstrated non-compliance with administrative inspection orders. His tone still carried that condescending arrogance, as if every word he uttered were engraved into the badge of a personal legal authority. But here, he could no longer hide the artificiality in his choice of phrasing. It was far too sanitized for the reality captured on screen. Elise hit pause. She opened another file, this time from the body cam mounted on Travis's uniform. The recording captured precisely the moment he shouted, "Here, I am the law," as his hand grabbed her shoulder and shoved her under the hood of the car. She paused. She rewound. This time, she pressed the AI behavior analysis button. The screen generated a graph mapping vocal tone, psychological cues, and hand force. Results appeared. Level of force exceeded standard in the first 3 seconds. Action disproportionate to subject's response. She flagged it with an internal code, FQ/0N1/unwarranted. The room fell completely silent. One technician glanced at another. Elise knew they were waiting for her to get angry, to show an emotional reaction, a crack. But what they received instead was precision bordering on indifference. She proceeded to extract the full communication logs of that shift, especially the radio transmissions Travis and his assistant used to prevent bystanders from intervening. His voice in the recording grated like iron nails scraped across a steel floor. "I repeat, anyone who advances will be dealt with for obstructing official duties." Elise typed a command. Flagged for misuse of authority. No hesitation, no annotation. After 2 hours, Elise moved to the personal data analysis station, where the entire behavioral incident history of Officer Travis over the past 3 years was stored. The data table stacked like a 7-layer wall, but she skimmed through it as if reading the morning paper. 27 traffic stops without stated cause, 9 citizen complaints dismissed without case initiation, 3 internal review proposals, all handled informally without written record. Elise tilted her head slightly. She was not surprised. This system had always known how to protect itself, until someone with the proper authority peeled away its layers one by one. She printed the full incident day report, filed by Travis, laying it on the desk like a blank page waiting to name the guilty. Elise took a red pen, the kind reserved for high-level investigations, and struck through each false phrase he had written. Subject exhibited aggressive reaction, signs of mild resistance. Refused to cooperate. Each line a slash, not for intimidation, but to correct the record with the blade of truth. An internal affairs officer entered, holding a printed copy of the report Travis had personally submitted. "Would you like to add anything?" Elise did not look up. She answered crisply, "No, I want less. Less lies." The officer swallowed hard, looking at her as if staring into a verdict not yet delivered, but already executed. When the file was complete, Elise did not send it. She carried it herself to the internal inspection office, meeting with the 3 regional coordinators. No appointment, no notice. The door opened and no one dared make her wait. She placed the file on the table, her voice not raised but sharp as cold steel. "I want this file reevaluated, not based on protocol, based on truth, and I will oversee every step of the review." One man in the room, who had once worked under her in a federal investigation, opened his mouth to object. Elise looked at him, no smile, no lifted eyebrow, and said only one sentence, "We are not in a meeting. This is a crime scene." He sat back down, said nothing more. Elise retracted no conclusions. She needed no personal justification, no emotional narrative. The only thing she used was evidence. And the truth, when presented with the proper clarity, requires no shouting. It generates aftershocks on its own. Leaving the room, Elise walked down a long hallway where portraits of former directors hung along the wall. The overhead lights reflected her image through each glass frame, like the silhouette of someone who had once vanished, now returned, not to reclaim a seat, but to clear a justice desk someone had just spilled coffee on and walked away from. She did not retaliate, but with every step she took, another fragment of trust was torn from the fraudulent phrases Travis had written, rearranged into an indictment no one could refute. No guns were needed, no arrests. All she required was to sit before a screen, stare directly into the system, and demand it examine itself, frame by frame, line by line, stain by stain. It thought had been erased. And that was the most terrifying form of retribution. No blade, just memory and intellect. There are truths that do not live in files, that do not appear in reports. They survive in memory, clinging like fine dust inside the lungs of those who once breathed too close to a system they could never change. Elise knew that, and because of it, after completing the data extraction, she did not return to the office. She went to the garage of the Elkhorn Valley Police Department, not for inspection, but for a dialogue, a conversation with the past. In the far corner of the lot, where the fluorescent light couldn't quite reach, an old man with silver hair was washing a patrol car with the steady rhythm of someone who had done it for 30 years, silently, methodically, never asking anything from justice. When Elise appeared, he wasn't startled. He simply looked up, gazed at her, then slowly shook his head. "I knew one day you'd come back." His voice was hoarse, soaked in old cigarettes and forgotten deployments. Elise didn't respond. She stood there, waiting. He exhaled and placed the hose on the soaked cement. "That boy Travis thought cuffing you meant he won?" He didn't wait for an answer, because he knew what Elise had done in the investigation room wasn't a reaction. It was a counterattack. "That boy," he shook his head faintly, his cloudy eyes drifting toward the administrative building. "He thought he was rewriting the law. But you know something?" He turned to look her in the eye. "His father was even worse." Elise tilted her head slightly, a signal that wasn't coercive, but just enough to open the memory vault of that aging man, a veteran officer who had witnessed more than he had ever written down. "Do you remember the federal hearing in District 9, 18 years ago?" Elise neither nodded nor shook her head. She simply watched. He continued, his voice slipping from a crack in memory he didn't want to reopen. "The presiding judge then was Raymond Blake, sat on the bench like it was a throne. Dismissed appeals like flicking ashes off a cigarette. That year I was still working support for the Judicial Protection Team. One time, I saw him throw an entire file across the floor and say, 'These black folks just cry all the time. They all deserve to be sent away.' He took a drag from memory, then let out a dry laugh. You know who signed the dismissal order against him?" Elise looked at the spreading puddle beneath his feet. The question needed no answer. The old officer bent down, picked up the wash rag, clenched it until his knuckles popped. "You did? You submitted the internal investigation conclusion. 43 pages, 32 cross-examined pieces of evidence, 6 anonymous witnesses, all to remove that rotten bastard from the bench before he could even tighten his tie." He laughed again, but within that laugh was an ocean of bitterness. "I've never seen anyone make a federal judge leave the courthouse without daring to face the press." Wind swept through the lot. Elise stood still as a stone, but her gaze seemed to orbit through its own course of memory, not because of Raymond Blake, but because of Travis, the son of a man she had once brought down. The circle closed, not with hatred, but with the sweetest mechanism of revenge. The law does not forget. The old officer sighed. "I remember the day his father got dismissed. Travis had just graduated from the academy. He came to the station, face purple, eyes ablaze, shouted at the lieutenant, 'I'll restore my father's honor. Black women won't be sitting on review boards anymore.'" He paused, then added, his voice sinking, "That kid didn't grow up to be a cop. He grew up to get even." A quiet chill slid down Elise's spine, not from fear, but because everything had become clear. Travis wasn't just an arrogant abuser of power. He was a recycled clone of a decayed authority, passed down from a filthy legacy Elise herself had once buried with an investigative stamp. And now that legacy had resurfaced like a corpse refusing to stay dead. "You know," the old man scoffed, "the day Travis got accepted into the regional patrol team. I wrote a report warning about his attitude, said straight out the kid had emotional regulation issues, especially with black women. You know what happened? My report was pulled from the system." He pointed at his temple, as if his memory was the only place left where what the system tried to erase could still survive. Elise took one step closer to him. "Report name?" she asked, her voice not loud but forged as if from molten lead. He slowly reached into the pocket of his old coat, pulled out a crumpled scrap of paper. "I didn't dare keep the hard copy, but here's the internal code. T9WC V2. Archived in 2015, hidden from access in 2018, 1 week after Travis got promoted." Elise took it, folded it carefully like a relic. The overhead light flickered once, then went out like a bowed head. Elise turned away, offering no thanks, because he knew, and she knew, this wasn't personal. This was systemic, and that system had once forgiven a father. Now, it would have to face the son. Back at the office, Elise didn't immediately open a new case. She accessed the encrypted archive system and typed in the code the old man had given her. A red alert flashed across the screen. "Archive access denied, flagged for internal privilege, nodaled." Elise didn't press her lips, didn't breathe heavier. She simply typed an override string with top-level supervisory clearance. The screen changed state. The file opened. First line, "Probationary Officer Travis Blake displays signs of aggression and pronounced gender-racial bias in simulation assessments." Last line, "Recommendation: do not authorize independent engagement in interactions involving female subjects, particularly those from minority groups." A buried document, a disregarded warning, a system failure framed as personnel adjustment. Elise flagged the entire file, re-encrypted it under special retrieval authority, this time to preserve it permanently. Travis was not merely wrong in his actions. He was the result of a system that chose to ignore alarms because of his last name, because of the looming shadow of a man who once wore a judge's robe and crushed opportunity after opportunity for the voiceless. And when that shadow was removed by Elise, the system didn't root out the disease. It left metastasis behind, and that metastasis, today, was the second stain bearing the name Blake. Elise closed the file and typed a brief note. "History does not repeat if the historian remembers to hold the pen." Then she stood up and walked toward the central coordination room. She knew it was time to escalate, no longer about a single act of misconduct, but about exposing a sequence of institutional missteps, programmed to regenerate violence, but cloaked in the language of the law. Memory, once validated by data, ceases to be personal story. It becomes evidence, and Elise forgets nothing. The file, re-encrypted with the highest level access privilege, rested neatly within a secure hard drive, but Elise did not need to carry a single sheet of paper when she walked into the meeting room. To her, evidence was not something to be slammed in anyone's face. It was an invisible blade, embedded in every breath, every word, and when she convened the federal and state councils alongside every representative from the Regional Judicial Oversight Board, it signaled a judgment that could no longer be delayed. On the central digital board, a single line displayed, "Special Review Session, LK." Also, no exclamation point was needed. The mere presence of Elise was enough for everyone to readjust their ties, tighten their collars, and lower their voices when speaking. The presiding chair attempted to open the session, but Elise did not take her seat. She stood, eyes scanning the room like a roll call through presence alone, needing no names. Because everyone already knew they weren't here for a presentation but to receive a directive, Elise began with a simple sentence, yet it made the entire room fall silent as if drained of oxygen. "I'm not asking for opinions, I'm demanding action." She walked toward the main screen, pressed a button, and an image of Travis appeared from the body cam footage, his hand gripping her shoulder, shouting, pushing her onto the hood. No effects, no overdubbed narration, just raw reality, exposed at a resolution sharper than any legal defense. "This is the conduct of an officer performing his duty," Elise said, her tone not raised but each word dropping like stone slabs. "Toward a civilian who had committed no offense, made no reaction, posed no threat." She switched to the audio report submitted by Travis. The subject displayed uncooperative behavior, negative reaction, obstructive conduct. She offered no commentary, for the contradiction between image and statement was already the heaviest indictment. She turned to the State Department of Justice representative. "Does your report review process include a system for cross-checking false claims?" The representative stammered. "We do have a mechanism for comparison, but the priority level for such reviews," Elise cut in unceremoniously, "not enough, and no longer acceptable. From today onward, I demand a full overhaul of the field report audit system for this district. No exceptions, no privileges." A representative from the regional police department, known for his conservatism, shifted in his seat. "We do not deny the severity of the incident, but is this perhaps an overreaction?" Elise looked straight at him, her gaze not accusatory but cold enough to chill the air. "What is an overreaction? When a system is forced to look at itself, or when someone like me dares to stand tall while still in handcuffs?" The question needed no answer. It sliced past layers of excuse, cutting straight into the rot beneath. Elise opened another file, an extract of Travis's duty logs from the past 6 months. Stop frequency, time of day, subject demographics. They all follow a pattern of blatant discrimination. Over 78% of stops involved people of color, 52% were women, and in 91% of cases, documentation was demanded without any record of actual traffic violations. A member of the oversight board exhaled, flipping through the document. Elise gave him no time to look up. "This is no longer a personal infraction. This is a behavioral model, and that model has been left unchecked for far too long by silence and compromise. Outside, the press had been barred from access, but inside the soundproof glass room, faces once used to commanding sat still, restrained by something they could no longer deny: cold logic, hard data, and a woman who refused to take one step back. "I demand the immediate suspension of Officer Travis Blake," Elise declared, each word etched like stone, "not for punishment, but to prevent recurrence. I also demand the formation of an independent investigative task force to audit the entire field procedure chain, the complaint intake process, and the promotion protocol within the local patrol system. From 3 years ago to present." A sharp breath came from a corner of the room, but no one dared voice opposition. Elise looked around as if framing the moment to remember who averted their eyes, who clenched their fists, who tightened their lips in resistance. Then she spoke slowly, pouring molten lead into the air with each word. "If you wish to protect the system's reputation, remember this: reputation does not come from how we speak about justice. It comes from how we handle a mistake when justice has been insulted." A federal delegate with silver hair, long known for clashing with Elise in previous sessions, said nothing this time. He nodded, not a grand gesture, but enough to compel the rest to self-correct. Elise walked toward the board, shut off the screen. "This meeting ends when action begins. I will not step back, nor withdraw a single proposal. And if the system needs a model to understand how to respond, look at what happened in that parking lot. Ask yourselves, what allows a handcuffed woman to rise taller than the man who pushed her down?" No one answered. No one dared. Elise walked out of the meeting room without turning back. The door closed behind her, its echo like the final punctuation mark on every excuse. And, like the opening line of a systemic cleansing, where law is no longer a decorative cloak but the blade Elise would wield with her bare hands, slicing through every rotting mass a whole machine had allowed to fester for far too long. As the door to the meeting room closed behind Elise, the echo of the decision just rendered still lingered in the air, like an invisible aftershock reverberating through the decayed structure the system had long masked under the name of justice. But if the ground had begun to crack, then the roots could not remain hidden in the mud forever. And the most bitter truth for Travis Blake was not that he had been suspended, nor that his name now appeared in the National Misconduct Registry. It was that the name Blake, the one he had always believed was a badge of guaranteed power, was now unmasked as a stain that had never been cleansed. 3 days after the review hearing, an independent journalist released an old audio recording, secretly captured at a private reunion of the State Police Academy Alumni Association in 2016. Travis's voice rang out clearly, with no need for authentication. "I swear I will never let those black lawyers ride our necks again. They think my father fell and that's the end of it. I'll return the slap they dared to throw." That sentence, arrogant, racist, unapologetically raw, spread across social media like a nail sealing the coffin of his public honor. It was not a slip of the tongue. It was a worldview. And the one he meant to slap back from the past was none other than Elise Whitaker. But Travis had chosen the wrong battlefield, and more importantly, he had chosen the wrong opponent. In his mind, Elise was the embodiment of what his father once called a threat to white order. To him, Elise was not a person. She was a symbol of the kind of justice the Blake bloodline had always tried to strangle. But he had forgotten. Symbols cannot be subdued by bare hands, especially not when that symbol had once brought his father down before he could even utter a rebuttal. Back then, Raymond Blake, Travis' father, was the federal judge of District 7. He was known for his harsh rulings, but his criteria were consistently uniform. The conviction rate for black defendants was 3 times higher than for white defendants charged with the same crimes. He once denied the retrial of a teenage boy convicted of rape, despite DNA evidence proving the boy's innocence, stating simply, "The system needs stability, not belated regret." That very case became the spark for a quiet investigation led by Elise, then head of the DOJ legal coordination team. No press conferences, no exposure, only closed-door meetings, compiled dossiers, and evidence collected piece by piece, from testimonies of witnesses who had once stayed silent out of fear. And then one day in March, in an unannounced session, Raymond Blake was removed from office. No handcuffs, no shackles, but Elise laid a 47-page indictment before him, with the note, "No rebuttal needed. This is not a court, this is the truth." He never signed a resignation form, but he never returned to court again. His position was revoked, his name erased from the federal judicial roster, no farewell article, no tribute, just a blank space where his portrait once hung, a silent stain the legal world dared not speak of. But Travis had never forgotten. To him, Elise was not just the person who cost his father his bench. She was the reason his entire lineage had bled reputation. He grew up in the shadow of that festering resentment, nurturing arrogance as if it were a warped form of faith. He did not study to understand the law. He studied to manipulate it. He did not take the exam to become a servant of justice. He took it to gain power. Power to drag the dark figure named Whitaker into the light and strike it down in the name of order. But life was not a parking lot, and identity was not defined by skin color. Travis's downfall, bitter as it was, happened in the very setting where his father had once been dethroned, behind closed doors, before the eyes of those he once believed would protect him. But now, they were the first to sign the order for his suspension. As if shedding a long-standing tumor, the system had carried simply out of deference to the Blake name. In a small, isolated room at the police department, Travis slumped before a screen, where Elise's image was being live-streamed from a statewide police reform hearing. No one forced him to watch, but he could not look away. Elise's voice rang out. Not loud, not harsh, but each word seemed to slice into his ear. "We do not purge people, we fix systems. But if anyone insists on becoming a tumor, do not expect to be removed gently." He clenched his fists, nails digging into his palms until they drew blood. But blood could not erase what had transpired. He had lost, and the most painful part, he had lost exactly as his father did, at the hands of the same woman, under the same gaze, with the same quiet resolve that brought an entire system to its knees without ever raising a shout. To Elise, this was not victory. This was continuation, a chain reaction that could not be avoided when a system is unmasked from within. She needed no applause, no name recognition. She only needed to glance once more at the Blake family and understand. Justice never forgets, even if it must pass through 2 generations, 3 titles, and decades of lies. Her office lights remained on late into the night. On her desk, a copy of Raymond Blake's file sat beside the file of Travis Blake. 2 folders, 2 eras, but the same ending. Defeat at the hands of someone who did not need violence to win. Only a memory sharp as steel and a will forged harder than iron. Within the system, no one dared see Elise as just a black lawyer anymore. They knew, and would never again forget, that they had crossed the wrong person. Once with the father, once with the son. And both times it ended the same way, in silence, but as heavy as a lifelong sentence that would never be erased. When the 2 case files bearing the name Blake were sealed inside the internal vault of the Department of Justice, that was when the system began to enforce its silent sentence. No sirens, no verdicts, no guillotine. Yet every detail surrounding Travis Blake began to rot, every social tether unraveling without a sound, every familiar door slamming shut in his face in a manner so quiet it was absolute. Silence, the cruelest form of punishment ever devised by the system, and this time it chose Travis as the lesson in full. On the day his suspension was issued, Travis was not escorted out by agents, not put in handcuffs, but no one came to see him off either. The people who used to drink beer with him after shifts said nothing. They avoided his gaze as if it carried contagion. The locker room where he once clapped colleagues on the back had become eerily empty. His locker had already been remotely locked, access codes deleted, key card disabled. No announcement needed, just a series of cold technical actions. Enough to say he no longer belonged here. Travis stood there, still holding the useless keycard, palm clenched, fingernails pressed into the plastic. No one approached. Not a single "hang in there" or "I believe in you." Only the sound of footsteps brushing past him as though he were a gap in the hallway. That silence didn't stab. It decayed. It rotted his pride, hour by hour, and Travis, though standing under bright lights, could not fend off the darkness consuming him from within. Total isolation. And called his family's longtime attorney, the one who had handled minor complaints, drank whiskey with his father, once declared, "The Blakes are the legal pillar of the Midwest," but this time, the voice on the other end was colder than ice. "I'm sorry. Your case poses a conflict with our current legal commitments," Travis shouted into the phone. "You swore you'd never walk away from me." But the line had gone dead. No signal, no reply. He reached out to 5 other law offices, from private to national, from close allies to neutral entities. They all gave the same response. "Sorry, we are not accepting cases related to the Elkhorn Valley incident." A region that once bent to his will had now become a restricted zone. No warning signs were needed. His name alone on a file cover was enough to have every door shut firmly and without negotiation. Travis began drafting his own responses. He combed through documents, typed out arguments, cited legal precedents, invoked procedural history, but each submission only returned an automated email. "Please contact us through a recognized legal representative." Without an attorney, without representation, he did not exist in the justice system he once served. He was erased through procedure, locked out by protocol, and no one had to lift a finger, because the very law he once invoked now wrapped around his neck with the same language he had used to suppress others. Family, in the last place he thought he had support, didn't stand by him either. His mother refused his calls. His sister left his messages unanswered. His uncle, A retired police officer sent only a single line: "Don't drag the whole family down with you." Travis sat in his temporary apartment, the jaundiced light casting sharp edges on his face. He stared at his phone screen. Calls unanswered, texts unread, signs multiplying that he was vanishing from the social map, not because he'd been arrested, but because no one wanted to admit he existed anymore. One evening, he returned to his usual bar, the one that reserved a seat for officers on duty, the one that used to hang his photo with the caption, "Outstanding Officer of the Year, 2018. But the bartender only looked at him for a second before turning away. "We don't serve guests with ethics violations on record." Travis stood frozen, throat tightening. His photo had been removed from its frame. In its place, a handwritten sign hung quietly. "Not everyone who wears a uniform deserves respect." Travis had no more anger to unleash, no fists left to throw. He sat alone in his car, turned on the radio, only to hear a broadcast analyzing the Elkhorn Valley case. It wasn't sensationalized anymore. It was a civics lesson in school textbooks. He shut off the radio but still heard Elise's voice echoing in his memory. "They didn't save me. They're saving you." That sentence was no longer a warning. It was a slow toll of the funeral bell inside his head, each strike echoing into the hollow pit of loneliness he had dug for himself. No one needed to bring Travis down. He fell on his own, step by step, and the most brutal part wasn't the collapse, it was how it happened, with no one reaching to catch him. No defenders, no mourners. His career crumbled like a pillar eaten from within by termites, outwardly intact but hollow to the core for years. Elise didn't need to say another word. No press conference, no public appearance, but her image, the upright posture even while handcuffed, the way she said, "Hold on to this until you learn to respect it," appeared every time Travis looked in the mirror. And that face, calm, powerful, unboastful, was the sentence he would never be pardoned from. Silence is the blunt knife the system grinds to sever its own decay, and this time it found the perfect rot to cut first. Travis was not just abandoned, he was erased from every trajectory as if he had never existed, a speck of filth swept into the crevice, then blown away by the cold, cleansing gust of justice. Not a single news outlet mentioned Travis Blake in the following week. He vanished from headlines, from conversations, even from the public's scorn, as if the system had expelled him into a void no one wished to glance back toward. But amidst the politically frozen air, cold as steel after Elise's counterstrike, a handwritten letter arrived at her office. Small, plain, with no organizational seal or official memo. Just a white slip tucked into a wrinkled envelope, its border traced with light pink crayon and a slanted line of childish handwriting, "To Miss Elise." Elise took the envelope from her assistant, her eyes briefly pausing at the innocent lettering. No official seal, no encryption, just a postal stamp from a town on the edge of Elkhorn Valley. She opened the letter, not with haste, not with suspicion. Inside were a few lines, penned in a student's hand, clumsy, yet carefully formed. "My name is Maya. I am 9 years old. I was at the parking lot that day when the police officer yelled at you. My mom covered my eyes, but I peeked. I saw your face pressed onto the car hood. I thought you were going to scream. I was really scared because I thought screaming was the only way to fight back, but you didn't scream. You just spoke, really quietly but clearly. I didn't hear all the words, but I remember your eye. They weren't scared. They were like silent thunder. Thank you for not screaming. Because of that, I learned that sometimes silence is stronger than a gun." Maya. Elise read each word without blinking. The room seemed to narrow under the sudden weight of stillness. The assistant, waiting to deliver a report, didn't dare speak, not because the atmosphere was tense, but because the woman the entire country was watching, the one who had challenged the system, who had forced the state government to make amends, was now standing silently, her hand crumpling a small letter, her eyes unshaken but more misted than usual. The letter bore no political message, no requests, no criticisms, no praise. It was something the system could never manufacture. a pure truth. Among all the press statements, analytical essays, hashtags, and polarized debates, it was a child who expressed most accurately what Elise had done. She had not screamed. She had not needed to glorify herself. She had not retaliated in anger. She had stood firm in a silence weighted with a century of struggle. She placed the letter into her personal file, amid pages inked with system codes, red stamps, and procedural directives. It carried no security classification, yet it was the one document no law could disqualify, because the law could not write what Maya had written. The next day, Elise stopped by a department-organized civic education seminar, announced unscheduled. When she entered, there were no claps, only the eyes of teachers rising to greet not a celebrity, but a principal. She didn't walk to the stage, didn't take the guest chair. She simply handed the coordinator a photocopy of Maya's letter and said, "Let the students read this if you think it's appropriate." The coordinator skimmed the paper, then looked up and asked, "Did she react when she received the letter?" Elise just smiled and answered, "I replied by staying silent." Just like that day, no one dared turn Elise into a symbol while she still stood there, because she wouldn't allow it. To her, real strength did not come from being a pedestal. It came from teaching others they could stand on their own, even with handcuffs on. Maya's letter was reproduced, circulated across education forums, and even reprinted in an internal school book in a New Jersey district as the opening for a lesson titled Power and Silence. Online, comments poured in, expressing emotion, but Elise responded to none. No follow-up interviews, no official statement, because if she spoke, her voice would overshadow the purity of the child. And this time, she let the child speak for an entire era. At the same time, an opinion piece in The Atlantic wrote, "When a child understands that silence can roar louder than gunfire, that is not just education. It is the transfer of consciousness." But Elise never read the article. She was sitting alone in the old third-floor office at the coordination center, desk lamp casting light on her face as she looked down at another page, the back of the letter, where Maya had drawn a woman standing tall, hands cuffed, but at her feet her shadow was shaped like wings. Not every system can understand such a symbol, but Elise did, and that is why, after everything, she still chose not to scream. Because sometimes, silence at the right moment, in the right place, by the right person, is not surrender. It is the only way to teach what true power means. And Maya, the 9-year-old child with crooked handwriting, had just become the smallest but most important witness to a cleansing that needed no gunfire. Maya's letter remained in Elise's files as a living artifact, not only for its clarity, but because it marked the first sign that what she had done wasn't just seen, but understood. But while a child learned the concept of strength from silence, on the opposite side, a grown man was approaching the bottom of the price. Arrogance always demands, quietly, but without fail. Travis Blake, once a patrol officer in Elkhorn Valley, once someone who believed he had the right to determine another's dignity through tone and badge, was now nothing more than a name in a red-stamped final report of severe misconduct, with no right to appeal. The announcement of the investigation's outcome didn't take place in a grand auditorium, had no media seats, and wasn't live-streamed. It was held quietly in a state-level conference room, as if the authorities no longer wished to repeat the name Travis in the same airspace as justice. On the main screen, evidence was presented: footage, reports, behavioral data, and especially Elise's internal testimony, stored under the encrypted code FQ code/AX9, single access, non-replicable. The session chair read each line with firm voice, every syllable chiseled into metaphorical marble. Officer Travis Blake has severely violated operational protocol, abused authority, exercised unnecessary force, manipulated incident reports, and exhibited clear racial bias. Decision: permanent dismissal. No reinstatement, no eligibility for any state or federal law enforcement position. There was no applause, no sighs, only a period not to end a man, but to close the coffin on an era of reckless conduct, wrapped in the veneer of official duty. Travis was not present. He was notified by formal letter with no explanation, no final hearing, because the system had heard enough. And this time, it acted. Elise was not there either. She wasn't in the front row, not behind the curtain watching. She didn't need to witness. She had seen enough. She understood exactly how justice feels when it is carried out without trumpets. Because what she pursued had never been Travis. Her target was the structure that allowed someone like him to exist unchecked for so long, and once that broke, his removal was not a victory. It was just the consequence. At the session, the coordinator read a closing line, the only statement Elise left behind after declining the invitation to attend. "We do not punish people. We correct systems." The sentence carried no exclamation mark, but it echoed in every attendee's mind as a verdict heavier than any resolution. It severed all grounds for excuse. It stripped away personal justification to reveal what justice truly looks like. Cold, precise, unmerciful, and never petty. Travis received the notice in a rented apartment, buried deep within a bland residential block, its window facing the brick wall of the building across. Light couldn't even enter well enough for him to read the page's color clearly, but the red text, "Permanent Dismissal," didn't need light to burn into his mind. He didn't break down. He didn't scream. He just sat there, letter in hand, face hollowed from the inside. After all the years spent in his father's shadow, all the effort poured into upholding the Blake name as untouchable, now that very name had become one no one dared to utter, a dirty taboo in the state's judicial history. Travis's face bore wrinkles not from time, but from silent collapse, the kind no one laughs at, but every door closes against. It was the failure of a man not struck down by fists, but strangled by silence, the kind built from thousands of watching eyes that said nothing but remembered everything. In a conference room in Washington, a senior official asked Elise over the phone, "Would you like us to hold a press conference about the decision on Travis?" She was silent for a few seconds, then replied, soft as air, sharp as a blade, "No need. What deserved to be said has been seen, and what needed to be seen is in the decision." Following her nod, the entire federal apparatus began reviewing promotion criteria, recruitment protocols, and officer transfers across the state's law enforcement system. Travis was no longer a case. He was the rupture, not to end him, but to initiate a chain of accountability. The system could no longer defer. Elise never claimed to be the beginning. She simply left behind unmistakable indicators. From behavior, from data, from the way a woman pinned to a car hood stood back up as though she had never knelt. At a public administration seminar in Illinois, the name Travis was brought up not as a person, but as a faulty variable in the algorithm of public service ethics. When one attendee, an old classmate of his, tried to defend him by saying, "Anyone can make mistakes under pressure," the room didn't react. But the federal HR director, without looking up, placed a folder in front of the speaker. It contained detailed testimonies from those who had worked with Travis, along with the transcript of a staff meeting where he mocked that chick pretending to be a hero. The audio played for 30 seconds, just enough to drain the room of any will to keep listening. The classmate withdrew the statement, not out of coercion, but because no words could survive such a badly timed grin. In Colorado, a police training unit held its traditional alumni celebration, including a segment honoring graduates with outstanding contributions. But when Travis's photo appeared in the slideshow, over half the faculty stood up and left the auditorium. No one shouted, no one defamed him. They simply walked out under the puzzled gaze of the students, leaving behind a frozen image on the screen, Travis in ceremonial uniform, abandoned among empty chairs. A student secretly recorded the scene and uploaded it to TikTok with the caption, "When the past is no longer honored, the chair no longer matters." 11 million views in 36 hours, forced a disciplinary board to convene, and ultimately removed Travis's name from the lifetime honors list. A former politician who had once publicly accused Elise of stoking public emotion was later tracked by law students for involvement in covering up internal complaints 5 years earlier. Though not prosecuted, he was forced to decline a speaking invitation at the university where his son studied. When he appeared at the event, the projector unexpectedly played a clip of Elise's proceeding at a club, one he had once cut short during a hearing. Silence doesn't kill conscience, it just shows it how it served. The coordinator claimed it was a technical coincidence, but the crowd didn't believe it. That coincidence sparked over 200 social media posts, all saying the same thing. "We didn't forget what you cut, we just played the part you dodged." It was no accident either that a PR firm once hired to manage the media crisis when Elise was arrested was suddenly dropped by 3 major clients. Because a student journalist network discovered the firm's lead strategist was behind the campaign to erase Elise from the frame, when an internal message leaked including the line, "She's quiet, easier to reshape," and was posted on Reddit, the firm issued a public apology. But the real blow came when 5 former interns released videos explaining how they were pressured to edit Elise's footage to portray her as overreacting. Each clip was under 2 minutes, without narration, ending identically. "We couldn't fix that image, because that image was the truth." Elise didn't need to call for further investigation. She didn't grant interviews. She didn't ask to reclaim any stage that once shut its doors on her, because every name that once held the spotlight now found themselves under reversed lighting, and they couldn't endure the kind of exposure they used to demand of others. Elise never claimed to be the origin. She simply left behind undeniable clues, from behavior, from data, from the way a woman pinned to a hood stood up as if she had never bowed. And that was the real verdict, not the stamped dismissal order, but the fact that, after it was announced, no one spoke Travis's name in sorrow. No one stood up to say, "if only," no excuses, no defense, not even a token gesture. That silence was an obituary that didn't need to be printed. And Elise, though not present to see it, had left her imprint exactly as she handled everything else. Quiet, but piercing. Silent, but thunderous. The cost of arrogance is not being arrested, it is being proven wrong, in a way no one is willing to share the burden for. Travis is no longer attacked. He is left behind. And in a world that once applauded his uniform, being left alone is the only way he could learn. Power without ethics is not a weapon, it is a trap. And he had walked into it without knowing the way out. The cost of arrogance doesn't need to be preserved by the press. It settles naturally into public consciousness like sediment. Slow, but certain. And when the dust of judgment has settled, what remains is not the name Travis Blake, but a figure standing upright, without a stage, without a spotlight. Elise Whitaker, without ever appearing, became the first chapter in a new curriculum, not published by the government, not vetted by the Department of Education, but hand-selected, copied, and distributed by hundreds of teachers across states as a non-negotiable lesson on power, ethics, and the weight of silence. And while Elise remained silent, never once speaking the name of the man who once cuffed her, the name Travis Blake reappeared in a way no one expected, not as a person, but as a comparison tool for students to illustrate the meaning of false power. At a public school in Michigan, a student wrote in a final essay, "Blake had a gun, a badge, and the law behind him, but Elise had a gaze that made no one dare look away. One side controlled others through procedure, the other made the system reflect on itself through mere presence." The teacher didn't critique the sentence, only circled it, underlining the phrase, "the gaze." At a university in South Texas, where one of Blake's former colleagues had just been invited to lecture on ethics in law enforcement, first-year students quietly launched a campaign. Each person carried a whiteboard, displaying one of Elise's quotes, held aloft as the man entered the lecture hall. No shouting, no protest, just youthful, solemn eyes, holding messages like, "Justice has no privilege," or "Silence isn't weakness, it's the depth of understanding." The man did not teach that day. He quietly left the campus, captured in an 18-second video. No background music, no edits. But it spread to over 2 million views in 10 hours. Not because of anything he said, but because of what he had failed to say when it mattered. Not far from Washington, at a small cafe Blake used to frequent, the owner decided to print Elise's image on a special ceramic mug, displayed at the checkout counter. When a customer asked, "Who is this?" the barista replied, "The one who cleared the table for justice." The next day, someone smashed a mug outside the shop, leaving behind a crumpled note. "She's a disgrace to the force." But the glass didn't tremble. Within a week, demand for the Elise mug was so high they had to post a sign. No new orders accepted before the 15th. And when Blake returned to the cafe after 3 months of silence, he was served in a plain white mug. No logo, no name, no promotion. When he left, no one said goodbye, but the door shutting behind him landed precisely like a period. Even within academic circles, where Elise had once been dissected in the cold language of legal analysis, neutrality no longer held. A journal article labeling her actions as emotional manipulation of the public was retracted by the publishing magazine after the academic community issued an open letter. If a single gaze can make us redefine the entire system, perhaps the fault lies not with the eyes, but with where they land. The letter garnered over 1,000 signatures within 48 hours, including the names of 3 professors who once graded Blake's senior thesis. Professors who now publicly stated we once believed wrongly. At a high school in Vermont, during a civics class, the teacher turned on a projector without introduction or explanation. The screen showed Elise, pinned against a car hood, hands cuffed, eyes like unbroken steel nails, and behind her a crowd beginning to record. The teacher asked, "Who holds real power in this image?" One student raised a hand, the person in uniform. The teacher didn't respond. Another student spoke slowly. "No, the person in cuffs," because she didn't have to fight. She just looked, and the system collapsed on its own. No one disagreed. No one laughed. The class sat still, like in meditation. For the first time, they saw power that didn't shout or pound the table. It stood still and made everyone else adjust. From Texas to Oregon, from inner-city high schools to civic education sessions and juvenile rehabilitation centers, the name Elise began surfacing not as a victim or a hero, but as a formula where behavior, dignity, and consequence connect in an unbroken equation. A teacher in Atlanta shared on a national education forum, "I don't teach theory. I just show them the clip of Elise turning her head and saying, 'They didn't save me, they're saving you.' One sentence, and my students understand the difference between power and authority." But while classrooms quietly dissected the moral structure of an action, outside school gates, those who once shaped that moment were now facing slow, unyielding backlash. The police unit commander who once said on live television that Elise should be grateful she wasn't shot was forced to resign after a leaked internal recording revealed him calling the Elkhorn Valley incident a necessary move to put overconfident black folks back in place. At his retirement press conference, no one asked a question, but behind the podium there was a row of empty chairs. On each one, someone had silently placed a slip of paper that read, "No one has the right to handcuff the law, especially because of its color." The communications aide, a female spokesperson, who once cut off Elise's microphone mid-sentence and sneered, "We don't respond to emotion," was fired just 4 days later, after footage of that moment was dissected frame by the online community. An educational YouTube channel even produced a rebuttal video, contrasting her reaction against the ethical guidelines of professional public communication. When she tried to re-enter the media industry with her own podcast, the pilot episode was canceled before airing, after the lead sponsor received over 1,000 emails from students of law and media asking just one question: "We're studying to speak truth. Why are you sponsoring someone who once silenced it?" In Western California, a professor who once wrote an op-ed describing Elise as the inevitable product of a generation that victimizes everything had his credentials to teach public ethics revoked. His university, under pressure from a petition campaign with over 50,000 signatures, was forced to host an open forum with students. But the session involved no arguments. It began with a young woman reading aloud the exact sentence he had written, then falling silent. One by one, 30 students followed, each reading a line, a quote, a prejudiced remark he had made over a decade of lectures. The last was a white student, voice steady. "We don't want your resignation. We want you to read yourself." The forum ended in a silence longer than any lecture. Meanwhile, at a commercial plaza in Seattle, where a banner once hung promoting order and community safety, sponsored by Blake during his tenure, local business owners voluntarily removed it. In a live stream of the takedown, a clothing store owner looked directly into the camera. "We used to think that was how safety worked, but justice doesn't need to hide behind anyone to be hoisted up. It needs to be looked straight in the face." The video garnered over 3 million views in 24 hours. Blake, when later spotted at a gas station, was refused pickup by an Uber driver. The driver didn't curse. He simply locked the car door, looked through the glass, and said, "I don't want my rearview mirror reflecting disgrace." The story didn't stop at the classroom. Local networks, followed by CNN, MSNBC, PBS, and several academic platforms, all requested special interviews with Elise. The topic was no longer the Elkhorn Valley case. It was her. How she confronted humiliation with the language of the system. Why she didn't scream, didn't strike, didn't sue, but made the entire mechanism react like acid poured onto steel. Elise declined them all. She didn't appear on television, didn't answer the invitations, didn't post any personal statements on social media. She only left one short message in an email to a senior editor. "I don't have a story to tell. Those who needed to understand already do. Those who don't want to won't change just because I speak more." That reply didn't discourage the producers. On the contrary, it was quoted as a defining statement, opening a series of educational materials on human rights leadership that require no preaching. An article in a prestigious education journal opened with a backlit image of Elise from a past congressional hearing, captioned, "A living symbol who doesn't need a stage." That line was printed on posters, hung in over 1,000 schools within 3 weeks. Students began writing essays about Elise, not to praise her, but to analyze what made someone change a nation's gaze without ever raising her voice. At a regional teachers' conference in the Northeast, just as the moderator was preparing to speak on student behavior and the impact of social media, a teacher raised her hand. "What do you think about the video of Elise's arrest and how students responded to it?" A simple question, but the moderator, who had once stated on national television that the youth are being led by sentiment instead of reason, was speechless. Behind him, 30 attendees simultaneously placed a printed still of Elise in cuffs on the table, captioned with the moderator's own past quote, "Improper conduct must be punished to preserve institutional credibility." No one spoke, but the sound of paper sliding echoed like a silent storm peeling away layers of pretense. The talk was cut short to 15 minutes, and the speaker left the stage with a disoriented gaze unlike anything he had experienced in his career. At an education summit in Arizona, a behavioral science expert who had described Elise as a psychological case distorted by social response stepped up to speak. But before she could begin, the main screen auto-grayed a quote from an 8th grade student in Minnesota. "She let the system touch its own shadow, and because of that, justice didn't need a gavel, just a mirror." No one in the room nodded. Only the moderator quietly unplugged the speaker's USB from the projector and whispered into the mic, "We won't play a talk the audience already delivered," more truthfully. A clip of that moment spread across the education community. No background music, no emphasis, yet tens of thousands of comments quoted the same line. "Justice doesn't need a gavel, just a mirror." In South Carolina, a university that had previously hosted an essay contest on order and discipline in public spaces faced student demands to retract the winning essay from the prior year because it had described Elise as a woman who failed to set an example for young citizens. The author was a research assistant to a sitting congressman, one who had publicly criticized Elise on Twitter before quietly deleting the post when backlash erupted. But the students didn't delete. They pinned the essay to the campus bulletin board beside a newly written piece by a first-year student. Short, 12 lines, ending with, "If justice once wore a black robe and held scales, now it stands at the hood of a car, hands cuffed, but head unbowed." A photo of the two essays side by side became a viral post on the university's Instagram, with over 16,000 shares in just 2 days. And in New York, a textbook review board that had previously rejected the inclusion of Elise's case in the Citizens and Government chapter, claiming it lacked sufficient objectivity, was forced into an emergency meeting after being accused of deliberately ignoring socially impactful examples. One board member, who had voted against inclusion, was confronted publicly by his own students. When he entered class, the walls were covered with Elise's quotes. No slogans, no hashtags, just fragments of reflection. Silence is also a response. I didn't resist to oppose. I stood still so the system would tremble on its own. No need to be right, just don't be wrong. He stood frozen at the teacher's desk, turned away, but the students remained silent. No one rose. No one laughed. The atmosphere weighed heavy like a judgment unspoken, the kind of judgment schools don't teach, but conscience insists on learning. In a classroom in Minnesota, a 14-year-old student wrote, "If it were me, I'd probably scream, probably fight." But she didn't. She let the system touch its own shadow. And because of that, justice didn't need a gavel, just a mirror. The teacher posted the line on Twitter. Within 24 hours, thousands of shares followed. But Elise, true to form, remained silent. She didn't correct, didn't celebrate, didn't reclaim the spotlight. She left a space, a necessary one, so others could fill it with their own awareness. For Elise, the most valuable thing was not being named. It was seeing young people learn that power is not something to seize, but something to understand, to wield properly, and to hold quietly without being devoured by it. She received a letter from the National Teachers Association, inviting her to be the keynote speaker at their annual conference, themed Silence, the New Sound of Leadership. Elise read the letter, folded it carefully, but gave no reply. She still came to the office every morning, still read reports, still revised minor regulations, still sent emails with no closing wishes, but the effect of her quiet presence grew in ways the system never anticipated. People began revising civics textbooks, rewriting illustrative examples, and for the first time, the name Elise Whitaker was included not as a victim of police misconduct, but as the woman who redefined silence as a form of leadership. As soon as those lines appeared in the pilot version of the new curriculum, a wave of individuals who had once gone on air to criticize Elise were suddenly named again, not by her, but by the students they had once taught. A high school principal who had written a letter opposing her name in textbooks, arguing that her non-compliant behavior could incite students to defy authority, was confronted by an internal vote from the school board after students reprinted the entire letter and distributed it to every parent attending the year-end meeting. When he stepped up to the podium, the entire front row, typically reserved for homeroom teachers, was empty, save for a blackboard behind him on which students had chalked a single line. "We don't need to learn obedience, we need to learn how to stand tall." At the same time, a political science professor who once called Elise a fleeting media phenomenon appeared on a major podcast to argue against her inclusion in textbooks. But during the live recording, the host placed a printed copy of the professor's old article on the table and slowly read excerpts, contrasting them with public reaction after the Elkhorn Valley incident. Each rebuttal he gave was met with a surge of angry emojis and comments hashtagged "Silence is not blind." Within 24 hours, the podcast had to pull the episode due to a record-breaking number of dislikes. The quote he once used to mock Elise, "Silence isn't strength, it's just evasion of responsibility," was turned into a meme and paired with a photo of him sitting with his head down during a press conference, where he resigned from the Educational Review Board. At the administrative offices of a police department in Georgia, where an internal report had once claimed Elise Whitaker failed to cooperate with investigators to justify the handcuffing, an incident took down the entire internal data system within 12 hours. The cause, a technician whose brother had been wrongfully arrested during a protest in support of Elise, submitted his resignation along with a handwritten note taped to the main server. "I didn't delete anything. I just did what the system once did to Elise, stayed silent so it could collapse on its own." The note was photographed and widely shared online, making him an unexpected symbol of resistance without a microphone. A television commentator who had publicly attacked Elise on live air, calling her a woman who knew how to perform and chose silence just to get praised, was targeted by a viewer campaign demanding his removal via a petition. In the next broadcast, when he attempted an apology, the female host, whom he had once mocked for defending Elise, looked straight into the camera in silence. She said nothing, but viewers understood that silence weighed more than 1,000 rebuttals. When the segment was uploaded to YouTube, that look was clipped and circulated on its own. In the comments, one line was pinned at the top. "Today we learned, some mistakes don't need to be called out. The echo from silence is enough to confront them." In a classroom for at-risk students, a teacher replayed the clip of Elise walking away from the car hood, still in handcuffs, head held high, and said, "She didn't need the cuffs off to walk, because true freedom isn't at the wrists." No one objected, no one scoffed. One notoriously impulsive student silently bowed his head and drew a silhouette in his notebook, hands cuffed, but surrounded by wind. The story of Elise, though never retold by herself, became a modern classic for the new generation. Not a tale that ended in triumph, not encased in awards, but immortal by how it taught people to recognize justice without needing to see the person who enacted it. And for Elise, that was always what she wanted, not to be seen, but to help others learn where to look. Amidst the ongoing discussions, the classrooms composing essays about her, and the conferences projecting her image on LED screens as a symbol of the new century, Elise Whitaker maintained her routine, arriving at the office at 6:30 in the morning, brewing her own coffee, reading reports, and steadfastly declining any unscheduled calls. People referred to her as a phenomenon. She did not deny it. They called her a living testament. She did not refute it. But when a young, slender journalist from a small editorial office sent an email with the sole subject line, "I don't want to interview you, I want to hear the last thing you haven't said," Elise opened the letter and typed the briefest reply she had ever written. 30 minutes, one time, no camera. The interview took place at an old cafe tucked away on 34th Street, where no one paid attention to Elise. Not because they didn't recognize her, but because they understood that today she needed to be heard, not observed. The reverent gazes had given way to silent respect, the kind reserved for those who have walked through fire without crying out, for those who stood firm when society demanded they bow. Yet, from that silence, many began to look toward the other side of the battle, where those who once mocked Elise, who ordered her handcuffed in front of her young daughter, who declared on live television that she was mentally unstable, now faced public scrutiny in ways they had never anticipated. Among them was Police Chief Reinald Miles, the man who interrupted Elise during her hearing, labeling her a dangerous agitator cloaked in intellect. 12 days after Elise left Congress, a security camera video surfaced from a small supermarket, showing Miles attempting to make a purchase, only to be refused service by the cashier. No one shouted when a middle-aged woman nearby asked loudly enough for all to hear, "Chief, I thought you didn't believe in a system of fair treatment." Miles stood frozen. The $10 bill in his hand fell to the floor, and no one picked it up. Within hours, the video reached 3 million views under the hashtag Justice echoes. In another development, the principal of the high school that had dismissed Elise at the age of 25 for bringing politics into the classroom faced a student-organized public forum titled What Elise Said in 2012. The discussion proceeded without school authorization. When security arrived to disperse the gathering, the entire auditorium stood and declared in unison, "We don't need your permission to remember the truth." The next day, a group of alumni erected a sign at the school gate. "You expelled a teacher. We preserved the value." The attorney who had called Elise a political tool on a late-night talk show was not spared the backlash. At a legal industry conference in Atlanta, he stepped onto the main stage to speak, only to have his microphone cut off after 8 seconds. The event's moderator, an older white woman, stood and announced, "We didn't cut him off. His past words have disconnected themselves from this society." The auditorium fell silent. No objections, no defenders. Even the college friend who once told Elise to her face that "you'll never have a voice without a man standing beside you" found himself listed by his advertising firm among partners with frozen images. After the online community uncovered a series of sexist comments he had posted throughout 2017 in a replayed clip, he sweated, denied, pleaded. But the outdoor speakers on the street played a snippet from Elise's first hearing. A woman doesn't need a man beside her to have a voice. She only needs the truth. Elise shared none of these events. She posted no thank you notes. She didn't repost any articles. She didn't call it justice. It was merely the delayed reaction of a society long accustomed to silencing the righteous and swiftly forgiving the wrongdoers. She wasn't pleased by their ostracization, but she wasn't saddened either, because the matter no longer revolved around her. It centered on what she had dared to speak. People could debate her arguments, her rebuttals, even her expressions during the hearing. But one fact was indisputable. She was unafraid. The journalist set down the notebook, refraining from turning on the recorder. Elise nodded. No formalities, no introductions. She simply began to speak, not with the voice of someone who had stood before Congress, nor with the tone of someone whose testimony had led to an officer's dismissal, but with the voice of a citizen expressing what she had long been compelled to withhold. "I didn't want fame," she said, eyes gazing through the misted window. "I never did. I didn't choose to be handcuffed. I didn't choose to be rescued. I just stood there at the right moment, in the right role, and the system reacted as it was bound to. I'm not a miracle. I'm the consequence of too many instances where people failed to respond adequately." The journalist asked, "So, what do you think is the most important lesson from everything that has happened?" Elise paused for 3 seconds, enough to weigh each word, as if selecting bullets for the precise target. "I just want the police to remember. Not everyone in an old suit lacks status, and no one has the right to handcuff the law." That statement resonated in the cafe like the knock of truth, needing no emphasis yet leaving a profound echo. No one drinking coffee at that moment looked her way. But everyone fell silent, because they understood Elise wasn't speaking about an incident. She had just affixed a new definition to the conscience of public authority. When those words were quoted in an article hours later, the ripple effect struck not only the media, it reverberated back at those who had once viewed Elise as a thorn to be removed. Travis Blake, the former officer who had ordered Elise's handcuffing right in the City Hall lobby, became the central figure in a closed district council vote on professional ethics. But what ignited public outrage wasn't his suspension. It was the scene of him exiting the headquarters after the hearing, approached by an elderly man around 70, who extended a tarnished badge. "I used to be a cop, but I won't allow someone like you to tarnish what I once upheld." Blake, startled, couldn't react, only watching as the badge fell to the ground and was crushed under the old man's own step. That clip, recorded by a student, was uploaded with a single caption: "This is honor." Not stopping there, during a seminar on community safety organized by a nonprofit organization, the program coordinator, who had previously defended Blake's actions on television, was directly confronted by an audience member. As someone who once called Elise Whitaker a delusional citizen, do you dare stand before this entire hall and repeat that? The coordinator did not respond. But what rendered him speechless was not the question itself, but the nearly 1 minute-long applause that followed. Not because Elise was present, but because, for the first time, the fear of authority had shifted direction. In another city, a veteran journalist who had previously written articles attacking Elise was denied an exclusive interview with an international organization. The reason was publicly stated via email. We do not collaborate with anyone who has used language to shield the act of humiliating women before justice. When the email content was leaked, instead of retaliating, he posted a feeble tweet. Perhaps I misjudged someone, but social media does not forget as quickly as he thought. The most liked comment read, "No, you misjudged an entire generation." Even the high school where Elise once studied, which had previously declined her invitation to speak due to concerns about public opinion, could not escape the ripple effect. The 12th grade students painted a graffiti mural right in the schoolyard, depicting Elise in handcuffs, with the caption below, "History is not written by judgment, but by the courage that is forbidden to speak." Instead of removing it, the school board was compelled to hold a public meeting with parents to explain freedom of expression within the educational campus. But during that meeting, a female student stood up and addressed hundreds. "We do not apologize for painting. They should apologize for letting her be handcuffed before she could speak." The journalist slowly nodded, intending to close his notebook, but Elise looked up, as if she had not finished speaking. "I do not blame Travis Blake. I do not feel proud that the system removed him, because if I feel joy over someone being crossed out, then I am just like him, thinking that justice is a personal matter. But no, justice is something that must be done, not for everyone, not against anyone, but to maintain balance for everyone." She paused, not out of emotion, but because the truth always needs space to settle. The journalist continued, this time more gently, "If there is one thing you want young people to remember about you, what would it be?" Elise looked at him for a moment, then smiled softly, not arrogantly, not humbly. "I do not need them to remember my name. Just remember this, power is not something we gain by standing above others, but when we stand at the lowest point, still preserving our dignity from falling to the ground." When the conversation ended, the journalist stood up and bowed. Elise shook hands and left the cafe without an escort vehicle, without bodyguards, without sunglasses. She walked on the sidewalk like an ordinary person. But the aftershock of those final words had begun to spread, from handwritten pages to forums, from personal blogs to the New York Times, where the article titled "Her Final Words" appeared on the front page the next morning, with a single sentence boldly printed between two white columns. "No one has the right to handcuff the law." People debated that statement for an entire week, on radio, in classrooms, at public ethics seminars. Some considered it a sharp political declaration. Some called it the ultimate moral conclusion, left by the old generation for the new. But for Elise, it was merely a sentence she knew, if not spoken, no one else would be silent enough to say on her behalf. And while the public was still choosing how to label that statement, a gunshot, a bell toll, or a legacy, those who once thought they had escaped were gradually feeling its weight in unforeseen ways. One of the first to face it was not the person who ordered her arrest, but the one who had declared on television that she pretended to be a victim to exploit public opinion. A former news editor who once held influence in conservative media. He appeared at a national media conference in Austin, stepped onto the stage as usual, but this time, when the lights shone down, the entire front row of the audience simultaneously turned their back. A thin ribbon was stretched across the aisle. No one shouted, no one disrupted, only a quiet sentence written with a marker. She did not scream. "So why are you afraid of being heard?" At the end of the event, he no longer gave a speech. The organizers sent him a thank you letter, along with a notice that this year's speech would be replaced by an article by Elise. Simultaneously, on an online legal forum where Blake, the former officer who handcuffed Elise, often participated under a pseudonym, an old chat log was uncovered. In it, he once boasted that if you need a deterrent example, picking the one who talks the most is the quickest. That statement had previously been read by only a few members, but this time it was screenshotted, paired with a photo of him sitting with his head down during an internal hearing, creating a meme that spread with the caption, "Anyone else feel like they're the example now?" When his personal page was locked, thousands of shares continued to repeat a comment. No one has the right to handcuff the law, and certainly no one is allowed to boast about doing so. Even at a small bar in Brooklyn, where the coordinator of the Values and Order seminar used to drink with friends and mock Elise with the nickname Queen of Disruption, an old recording made by a staff member was accidentally released. He called her a pitch-black brat who knows how to cry at the right moment. 3 days later, when he returned to the bar, the drink menu had been updated with a new item, Black Queen's Blend, and the server placed the glass in front of him with a cold smile. "This one is mixed with cold justice and long memory." He left without drinking, and the image of his hand placed on the glass, then withdrawn immediately, spread across political forums as a symbol of the type of man who once confidently laughed at others' pain but lacked the courage to swallow a name. The tension did not stop at individuals. A local council member, who had previously dismissed the proposal to reinvestigate Elise's case due to lack of supporting documents, was blocked by Columbia University students right in front of the campus gate when attending a seminar. They did not shout, did not hold banners, just more than 20 people standing in a row, each holding a white sheet of paper printed with a single sentence. "If she lacked documents, then we will fill your memory." He turned away, but the camera had already captured the moment he saw himself in the eyes of the young people. Eyes not angry, not reverent, just simply unbelieving. At a seminar at Columbia University, a young student asked a lecturer, "Is Elise the winner?" The professor paused for a moment, then replied, "No, because she did not play any game. She did not win. She reclaimed the truth." And that is what made Elise Whitaker a symbol. Because she did not choose to become part of the system to be honored, but to make that very system unable to continue operating wrongly without scrutiny. At the DOJ office, the photo of Elise being handcuffed in front of the car hood was no longer investigative material. It was hung in the hallway, below a gold-plated inscription, "The system has no eyes, but justice does." Elise did not attend the photo hanging ceremony. She also did not comment when hearing the news. But that morning, she arrived at the office 10 minutes earlier, stood in front of the photo for 5 seconds, then quietly walked into her office as usual. Not another word. At that very moment, on another floor of the same building, the man who had authorized her arrest, with nothing more than a single nod and a closed-door meeting, was undergoing an internal disciplinary hearing. No cameras, no press, but every witness was present. The man, now stripped of any special title, stood before 3 individuals he once deemed inferiors and listened to a recording he thought had been destroyed. "She thinks a few words can teach order? One solid hit will shut her up." That voice no longer echoed like it did when he declared it in the boardroom. Now it reverberated between soundproof walls like the sharp crack of a slap landing squarely on his own jaw. The person who replayed the recording was a tech staffer, one who had been ordered to delete the file from the drive but had quietly sent a backup to the Integrity Committee. As the man exited the hearing room, he met the eyes of a young receptionist who said nothing, only pressed a small slip of paper onto his chest. Justice does not need to shout. It has ears. 3 subway stops away, at Georgetown Law School, where a professor had once gone on national television to say Elise reacted emotionally and lacked fundamental legal understanding, the student body unexpectedly proposed the cancellation of his upcoming seminar. The proposal was rejected by the administrative board, who claimed Education must not be swayed by public sentiment. Yet, during the seminar, nearly every seat in the audience was covered with A4-sized printouts of Elise in handcuffs, each photo backed with the caption, "Is this the ignorance you called a lesson?" No one shouted, but he could not begin the lecture as the room filled only with silence and printed images. The following day he resigned from the academic board, not because he was forced, but because he could not answer the one question left on the board. If knowledge does not protect the truth, what is it? In a neighborhood on the southern edge of the city, the former chief supervisor of Precinct 17, the one who signed the order to arrest Elise, was asked by the local community to attend a public accountability meeting. It was held in a church, but instead of clergymen sitting in the front row as they always had, that day it was the mothers, those who had once been asked by their children, why was Miss Elise handcuffed if she was right, who took the front seats. An 8-year-old girl held a microphone and recited Elise's original courtroom speech. When she reached the line, "Justice does not wear a uniform," the entire church fell into absolute silence. The former supervisor bowed his head, but one mother stood up and spoke loudly enough. "You may bow your head today, but we have bowed ours for so many years, while no one bothered to look up." Then, in a small print shop near Capitol Hill, once hired to print flyers smearing Elise during her run for independent inspector, a staff member discovered an old invoice, still stored in the system, bearing the name of the organization that funded the defamation campaign. No break-ins, no search warrant. But at exactly 8 o'clock the next morning, the invoice was taped to the shop's front window, with a handwritten message in red ink we used to print for those who thought they were buying silence. No one signed it, but the paper was photographed and shared over 1 million times within 3 days, becoming a new symbol for a response that needed no words, only memory. Elise never retracted a single thing she had done. No pride, no regret, because to her, everything was as clear like the last light of day, not too bright, yet impossible to obscure. And so, with no additional tweets, no stage appearances, no bronze statues, Elise Whitaker completed a circle, not to be remembered, but to make sure no one dared forget. Justice does not wear a uniform. It has a human form, and it knows exactly who's touching it with dirty hands. Thank you for walking with Elise to the very last lines of this story. Each of us lives within a system of some kind, whether visible or unseen, and sometimes just a glance, a quiet act, or a timely word is enough to make the whole world stop and look again. Have you ever been disregarded, quietly handcuffed by prejudice, discrimination, or suffocating expectations? Share your story in the comments, because maybe your voice will empower someone else who needs it right now. Hit like, subscribe, and share this message so that what you've just heard doesn't end here, but spreads further, deeper, to those still searching for a glimmer of justice and belief in their worth. Every interaction from you is a form of speaking up, a way of standing tall, a small act continuing the greater current of what's right. Thank you for being here, and please stay. There is so much more we have to tell.